Section 1, Season 1: The Stolen Pilot, the Lawsuit Nobody Saw Coming, and How a 24-year-old Built a Television Empire on $50,000. There is something almost dreamlike about the way Family Guy came into existence, not with the polished, carefully managed arrival of a project that had been through 18 months of network development and focus grouped within an inch of its life. More like a miracle that barely cleared the runway. A 24-year-old animator from a small town in Connecticut, sitting alone in his kitchen at 2 in the morning with no sleep, no social life, and a budget that was essentially a rounding error in the context of network television. 6 months of drawing in near total isolation. 6 months of producing something by sheer willpower and obsession, something that would eventually be watched by hundreds of millions of people across the planet and spawn merchandise and video games and spin-offs and a cultural footprint that nobody in that kitchen in 1997 could have imagined. That is the origin story, the one that gets told at press events and in magazine profiles. The romantic version, the one where a passionate young creator suffers gloriously for his art and emerges with something the industry could not ignore. And that version is true, as far as it goes. But woven inside it, even before the show had aired a single complete episode, even before most of America had heard of it, there was already a dispute quietly beginning to form. A dispute about credit. About who made what. About whether the romantic, singular narrative of the lone creator was quite as accurate as the story preferred to be. And it would result in one of the more quietly remarkable lawsuits in the short history of animated primetime television. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut. He was the kind of child who understood cartoons not as passive entertainment but as active art. He drew constantly. He submitted comics to local newspapers while still in elementary school. He had a specific kind of ambition that does not announce itself loudly but that quietly organizes everything around it. The kind of ambition that produces a person who is drawing for newspapers at age 9 and attending the Rhode Island School of Design at 18 and working at Hanna-Barbera before his 22nd birthday. The Rhode Island School of Design, known to students and industry professionals as RISD, is one of the most prestigious institutions in the country for art, design, and visual media. MacFarlane earned his degree in film, video, and animation, absorbing not just the technical skills of the craft, but the intellectual framework that distinguished deliberate artistic vision from competent execution. While still in school, he made contacts with industry professionals and demonstrated enough talent to attract attention. By the time he graduated, he had already secured work at Hanna-Barbera, the legendary studio that had defined American animated television for decades. At Hanna-Barbera and its successor organization Cartoon Network Studios, he worked as a writer and animator on productions including Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He was learning from the inside, absorbing the rhythms of professional television animation, the relationship between writing and production, the gap between the idea in a writer's head and the finished frame on screen. He was not yet the person whose name would be on the side of the building. He was someone paying very careful attention, waiting for the right moment to arrive. The right moment arrived through 2 short films he had made during his time at RISD. The first was called The Life of Larry, produced in 1995 as a student project. It featured a heavyset, not particularly intelligent man named Larry and his talking dog Steve. The second was Larry and Steve, produced in 1997 as a proper short film meant for a broader audience. Both were rough by professional broadcast standards. The animation was simple. The production values were modest in the way that student films are modest, but something was alive in them that technical polish cannot manufacture. The comedic timing was there. The characters had specific personalities that felt distinct from each other and from the general landscape of animation at the time. And if you watch them, knowing what came next, the connection is obvious and immediate. Larry moved and thought and talked with the same stumbling, good-natured, perpetually confused energy that would define Peter Griffin. Steve had the same dry intelligence, the same slightly world-weary wit, the same quality of being the most sensible person in any room while also being a dog that would become the entire foundation of Brian Griffin's character. MacFarlane brought these characters to Fox through a connection he had developed through his work at Hanna-Barbera. The studio had previously made a deal with Fox for animated content, and he had established a professional relationship with executives at the network. Fox offered him an extraordinary opportunity and an impossibly small budget simultaneously. They would give him $50,000 to develop a proper animated pilot. If it was good enough, they would commission the show. $50,000 sounds like money until you understand the context. A standard episode of an animated primetime television show in the late 1990s cost approximately $1 million to produce. What Fox gave MacFarlane was 5% of that. Enough to do something, but not enough to do what a professional production house would do. He took the budget and went home. What followed was 6 months of the kind of work that most people would find genuinely impossible to sustain. MacFarlane drew in his kitchen. He described the experience in subsequent interviews as working with no sleep and no life, just drawing constantly. He was producing a pilot reel that would need to demonstrate an entire creative universe in roughly 7 minutes of running time. He needed to introduce characters, establish a comedic register, show the network what the show would feel like, and do it all with the production resources of a very modest student film. The resulting pilot was crude by broadcast standards. The animation was simple and rough. The characters did not move with the fluidity that a fully staffed professional studio would have provided. But it had the most important thing a pilot can have, which is a quality of life that technical imperfection cannot kill. The jokes landed, the rhythm worked, the characters felt like themselves. MacFarlane presented it to Fox executives Gary Newman and Dana Walden, and they ordered the series immediately. In July of 1998, Fox announced the purchase of Family Guy for a January 1999 premiere. And that is where the first complication in the show's history quietly entered through the back door. MacFarlane had not built that pilot entirely alone. During the production process, he had worked with a man named Jim Keeshan and his company, Jim Keeshan Productions. Keeshan was a professional animator and director with industry experience, and he had contributed to the animation production work that made the pilot presentable enough to show to network executives. The arrangement, as subsequent accounts described it, involved Keeshan providing directorial and animation support for portions of the pilot that MacFarlane was producing, largely through his own labor. When the show was greenlit, when the machinery of a network television series began turning with real money and real infrastructure, questions about credit and compensation arose. The pilot that had sold the show to Fox had been made with contributions from multiple people, and at least one of those people felt that the credit for what had been produced was not being distributed accurately. On the 1st of June 1999, just 5 months after Family Guy premiered on Fox to an audience of approximately 22 million people, Jim Keeshan filed a lawsuit against Fox Broadcasting and Seth MacFarlane. The claim was that Keeshan had not received proper credit or compensation for his contributions to the pilot. He had helped produce the animation that persuaded a network to spend millions of dollars, and his name appeared nowhere in the show's public-facing credits when it aired. The lawsuit alleged that MacFarlane and Fox had effectively appropriated his work without adequate acknowledgement or compensation. The official credits for the pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, listed Seth MacFarlane as creator and sole credited director, with Peter Shin as the additional director on the broadcast version. Keeshan's name did not appear in any public-facing capacity. On Wikipedia's page for the pilot to this day, there is a parenthetical notation listing Keeshan as an uncredited director alongside MacFarlane, an acknowledgement that arrived through historical documentation rather than through anything the show or network voluntarily provided at the time. The outcome of the lawsuit was never fully entered into the public record in the way that some legal disputes become. If a settlement was reached, its terms remained private. Neither Fox nor MacFarlane publicly discussed the case in ways that produced a definitive resolution of the question it raised. Keeshan continued to work in animation and education and appeared in the credits of a subsequent early Family Guy episode as an associate director and storyboard artist, which suggests some level of ongoing professional relationship. But the specifics of what that represented remain opaque. What the lawsuit does represent, regardless of its legal outcome, is a complication to the clean mythology of Family Guy's origins. The creation myth of a single passionate young animator working alone for 6 months, drawing with such intensity that the sheer force of his vision sold a network on a new show, is appealing precisely because it is the kind of story that makes the creative process feel heroic. But creative processes are rarely that solitary. They involve collaboration, assistance, borrowed expertise, and the people who provide that assistance sometimes feel, with varying degrees of justification that they have not received what they were owed. The Keyshen lawsuit was the first entry in what would become a very long ledger of disputes that would follow Family Guy across its decades-long run. The show that was about to become one of the most culturally ubiquitous animated comedies in the history of American television began its life in a legal dispute over credit and authorship. That is not the romantic version of the story, but it is part of the complete version. What is beyond dispute is what happened when the show finally reached television. The premiere aired on the 31st of January 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 23. The Super Bowl audience is the largest single-event television audience in American broadcasting. Whatever airs immediately after the game inherits a portion of that enormous viewership purely through circumstance. People are already settled on their couches. The television is already on. Whatever comes on next gets a massive, essentially captive audience. The first episode of Family Guy drew approximately 22 million viewers. That is a number that virtually no animated comedy achieves in the contemporary television landscape. In 1999, when streaming did not exist and the television audience was far more concentrated around broadcast networks than it would later become, 22 million viewers for a new show represented a significant cultural moment. People watched it. People talked about it. People had opinions about it the following morning. The 7 episodes of Season 1 were strange, funny, occasionally brilliant. The Griffin family was introduced with enough specificity to feel real. Peter was large, slow, good-hearted beneath the stupidity. His relationship with cultural nostalgia, his tendency to frame present experience through references to the 1970s and 1980s, gave his foolishness a specific flavor rather than a generic one. He was a man whose inner life was composed largely of pop culture, which was funnier than simple stupidity because it was a specific kind of stupidity that many viewers recognized. Lois was more fully realized than the patient spouse archetype she might have been. She had a history, a wealthy family background, a set of values and anxieties that complicated her position in the household. Alex Borstein's performance in these early episodes was exceptionally calibrated, finding the precise pitch that made Lois both funny and genuinely sympathetic. Stewie, in those first 7 episodes, was genuinely alarming in the best possible way. 1-year-old. Yellow shirt, diaper, high chair, baby food, and a voice like a British theater villain delivering monologues about world domination and the specific methods by which he intended to end Lois Griffin's existence. The gap between what he looked like and what he was saying was enormous, and the humor lived entirely in that gap. When Stewie explained in precise technical detail the weapon he was building, and the scene cut to show him sitting in his crib surrounded by Lego blocks, the laugh came from the juxtaposition being maintained with absolute commitment from all involved. Brian's function in those early episodes was less operatically comedic and more foundational. He was the ground, the thing that held the show's center while everything else spun around it. His dry awareness of the world's absurdity gave the show a perspective that prevented it from collapsing into pure chaos. Brian could look at whatever was happening and respond with a weariness that suggested he had always known this was coming. That quality made him uniquely useful. The writing team that MacFarlane assembled included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker, all of whom would become significant figures in animated television. MacFarlane was deeply hands-on with the writing as well, contributing directly while also managing the enormous job of voicing 4 of the show's main characters simultaneously. The first season drew 12.8 million households on average, ranking the show at number 33 inches the overall Nielsen ratings for that television year. For a new animated comedy competing against decades of established programming, that was a genuinely strong performance. The show had found an audience. The critical reception was positive. And then Fox proceeded to do everything in its power to make it impossible for the audience to find the show going forward. Drop a comment and let us know where you are in the world and what time it is right now. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing someone on the other side of the planet is settling in with these stories at the same moment you are. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's free and it keeps these coming. Section 2, Season 2. Fox's scheduling disaster, the show's first cancellation, and the episode Fox refused to air for 3 years. There is a specific and somewhat impressive way that a network can destroy something it owns by accident. Not through malice exactly, but through a combination of incompetence and institutional indifference that produces the same result as malice while allowing everyone involved to maintain plausible deniability. Fox Broadcasting's management of Family Guy during its second and third seasons is one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon in the history of television. The show's second season began airing in September of 1999 with a new time slot, Thursday nights, 9 o'clock in the evening. The network was building what it imagined to be a competitive Thursday lineup. The problem with this theory was that Thursday at 9 on NBC belonged to Frasier. Frasier, starring Kelsey Grammer as a pompous but deeply human Seattle psychiatrist, was not simply a popular show. It was one of the most decorated comedies in the history of American television. A show that had accumulated 11 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Comedy Series. Its audience was enormous, loyal, demographically attractive, and deeply habituated to watching that specific show at that specific time on that specific night. Placing a brand new animated comedy, still finding its audience, directly against Frasier was not a competitive scheduling decision. It was the television equivalent of opening a new restaurant across the street from an institution that had been serving the neighborhood for a decade, and then expressing surprise when the new restaurant's opening week numbers did not match the institution's. The ratings dropped. Of course they dropped. Fox responded by moving Family Guy to Tuesday nights, where it found itself competing with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. The game show phenomenon was at the height of its cultural saturation in 2000. Regis Philbin was on the cover of magazines. The format had captured something specific about that cultural moment, and the ratings it was generating were extraordinary. Family Guy was placed directly against this phenomenon, and then, when it failed to match those numbers, the network treated that failure as information about the show rather than about the scheduling decision. Fox kept shuffling the show to new nights and new time slots, sometimes with minimal advance notice to viewers. The audience for any television show is a creature of habit. People watch at a certain time on a certain day because that time and that day have become associated with the show in their mental schedule. When you move a show frequently and without adequate promotion of those moves, you do not simply inconvenience the existing audience. You systematically train them out of the habit of looking for the show. You teach them that it is not reliably findable, and eventually you teach them to stop looking. The ratings suffered, not because the writing had gotten worse. Some of the episodes produced during this scheduling chaos were among the finest the show would make, not because the audience had stopped caring. The audience that would eventually make Family Guy the best-selling television DVD of 2003 was already out there, already watching wherever the show happened to be on any given week. But the systematic instability of the schedule meant that, at any given moment, a meaningful percentage of people who would have watched could not find the show. Season 2 was also where the first major content scandal of Family Guy's broadcasting history crystallized. The episode was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and it was written during the second season with the expectation that it would air as part of that season's regular schedule. The premise involved Peter Griffin's frustration with his family's chronic financial instability and his conclusion, reached through the spectacular logical failure that characterized his thinking in the early seasons, that what he needed was a Jewish person to advise him on money management. The episode used this premise not to endorse the underlying stereotype, but to expose it as absurdity, following Peter through the process of discovering that the assumptions embedded in his thinking were wrong and reductive. The episode's most notable sequence involved Peter breaking into a full musical number called I Need a Jew, set to a melody that bore a close structural resemblance to When You Wish Upon a Star, the famous song from the 1940 Disney animated film, Pinocchio. The song was catchy, precisely written, and funny in the way it made Peter's thought process simultaneously idiotic and strangely earnest. He was not malicious. He was simply wrong in the way that people are wrong when they have absorbed stereotypes without examining them. Fox executives looked at the episode and declined to air it. The network's concern was that the content was too sensitive, too close to the line between comedy that examined stereotypes and comedy that simply deployed them. There was genuine uncertainty about whether the satirical intent of the episode would be legible to a general audience or whether it would simply be received as the thing it was commenting on. The episode was pulled from the schedule and placed in production purgatory, the status of completed but suppressed content that exists in legal and commercial limbo. It remained unaired on Fox for years. It was eventually broadcast on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block on the 9th of November, 2003, well after the show's cancellation, as part of the syndicated rerun package. Fox finally aired the episode on its own network in December of 2004, 4 years after it was written. The legal trouble did not arrive until 2007. In October of that year, a music publishing company called Bourne Company filed a federal lawsuit in the Southern District of New York. Bourne held the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star, and they alleged that I Need a Jew was copyright infringement dressed up in satirical clothing. Their attorney described the song as a thinly veiled copy of the Pinocchio melody, adapted to carry what they characterized as content that had damaged the reputation of the original song. The legal argument was substantively interesting. Parody protection under copyright law requires the new work to be commenting on the original, rather than simply borrowing its melody to make a different point. Bourne argued that I Need a Jew was using the melody not to say anything about When You Wish Upon a Star, but to make a different argument entirely, and that this distinction removed the parody protection. The defendants, including Fox, the show's producers, and McFarlane personally, argued that the use was clearly protected parody. The case worked through the federal court system for approximately 18 months. In March of 2009, United States District Judge Deborah Batts ruled in favor of Family Guy and Fox, determining that I Need a Jew qualified as protected parody. It was a complete legal victory. But the lawsuit itself, and the years of uncertainty surrounding it, added another layer to an episode that had already spent years being kept from the public. The Carol Burnett lawsuit arrived in the same year as the When You Wish Upon a Star dispute. Carol Burnett is one of the most beloved figures in American entertainment history, a comedian and actress whose CBS variety show had run for 11 seasons. Her signature character was the charwoman, a humble cleaning woman distinguished by her overalls, her mop, and the quiet dignity with which she performed ordinary work. Family Guy had placed the charwoman in an adult entertainment establishment, altered Burnett's signature theme music for the scene, and included a crude joke referencing the ear tug she performed at the end of her show as a signal to her mother. In March of 2007, Burnett filed a $2 million lawsuit against 20th Century Fox, alleging copyright infringement, right of publicity violations, and misappropriation of her name and likeness. The lawsuit was dismissed in May of 2007 on First Amendment grounds. The legal victory belonged to Family Guy, but the cultural conversation the suit had started was more complicated than the legal outcome could resolve. Burnett was a universally respected figure. Her decision to take the show to court put a spotlight on Family Guy's relationship with the people and characters it chose to satirize, and on the question of where satire ends and genuine disrespect begins. Season 3, which premiered in July of 2001, faced a Thursday night slot at 8 inches the evening. That put it against Friends, which had been the most watched show on American television for much of the previous decade. The ratings against Friends were predictably poor. CBS added Survivor to the competitive landscape, another enormous ratings magnet. By 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy for the second time. Fox attempted to sell the syndication rights. Finding buyers was, by the network's own account, extremely difficult. Cartoon Network eventually acquired those rights for almost nothing. According to the president of 20th Century Fox Television, the rights were obtained essentially for free, which captures the degree to which the show was considered commercially spent. Cartoon Network began airing Family Guy reruns on its Adult Swim late-night block in 2003. What happened was not expected by anyone. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire block. The reruns were drawing audiences that Adult Swim had never seen. The network boosted its overall viewership by 239%, according to subsequent reporting. At the same time, Fox Home Entertainment released DVD sets of the first 2 seasons. The complete first season sold over 2.2 million copies, becoming the best-selling television DVD of 2003. People were not just watching the show on cable. They were paying to own it. They were treating it as something worth a permanent place in their household. Fox, watching the Adult Swim ratings and DVD sales simultaneously, reached the uncomfortable conclusion that canceling Family Guy had been a mistake. By 2004, the network had reversed course. Family Guy would return in May of 2005, 3 years after its final original episode had aired. It became the first show in television history to be revived primarily because of strength in syndication reruns and home media sales, rather than anything related to first-run broadcast performance. The resurrection was genuinely celebrated as a demonstration of audience power, but it came with costs that would only become visible over time. The writing staff had dispersed during the hiatus. MacFarlane had developed new projects. The specific chemistry of the original room could not be perfectly reassembled through intention alone. The show that returned in 2005 would still be Family Guy. But something small and essential had shifted in the 3 years of silence, and that shift would compound with every passing season into something more significant than any individual change could represent on its own. Section 3, Season 3, The Near Miss That Changed Everything and Nothing. September 11th Shadow over the writer's room, and the last season before the scattering. To fully understand what Family Guy's third season represents in the context of the show's history, you need to hold two things in your mind simultaneously. The third season contains some of the finest episodes the show ever produced. Episodes that stand as examples of what animated comedy can accomplish when every element of a production is operating at its highest level. And the third season aired against the backdrop of an event that had a direct, personal, and nearly catastrophic connection to the show's creator. The morning of the 11th of September, 2001, began for Seth MacFarlane in Rhode Island. He had traveled there the previous day to deliver a speech at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design. After the formal event, he went out with friends in the way that people do after professional obligations have been discharged. He had drinks. He stayed out later than he probably should have given his early morning flight. He woke up with a hangover. His travel agent had given him incorrect departure information, telling him his American Airlines flight out of Boston Logan departed at 8:15 the morning, when the actual departure was 7:45. MacFarlane drove to Logan, navigated the airport, arrived at the gate, and was told the door was closed. He had missed his flight by approximately 10 minutes. He went to the airport lounge to wait for the next available flight and fell asleep in a chair. He woke up 45 minutes later to noise and commotion. The television in the lounge was showing footage of the North Tower of the World Trade Center with smoke billowing from its upper floors. Then the announcement came, naming the aircraft that had been hijacked and flown into the building. American Airlines Flight 11, the 7:45 flight from Boston to Los Angeles. The flight he had missed by 10 minutes because his travel agent gave him the wrong time. MacFarlane sat in an airport lounge and watched the second plane hit the South Tower on live television, understanding with complete clarity what had just happened and the nature of the thing he had accidentally not been part of. His assistant had been left a message saying he was taking a later flight, but the message had not been received in time, which meant that for roughly 20 minutes, people who knew him believed he might have been on that plane. He described the experience in subsequent interviews with a quality of calm equanimity that some listeners found remarkable given the magnitude of what had almost happened. He spoke about it as a fact. He expressed appropriate awareness of what it meant without performing grief or guilt in ways that would have been disproportionate given that he had not, in fact, been on the plane. He noted that the show had subsequently made references to both the attacks and to the cultural and political context around them. One specific piece of evidence of the attack's impact on the show involves a cutaway gag that had appeared in the Season 2 episode Road to Rhode Island, which had aired in May of 2000. The gag referenced Osama bin Laden in an airport security context. In May of 2000, this was simply an absurdist reference. After September 11th, that gag was quietly removed from the DVD release of the episode. The version that most audiences encountered when they bought the Season 2 DVD was the edited version, with that sequence absent. MacFarlane later discussed the survival story in terms that acknowledged its strangeness. He noted the combination of a hangover, an incorrect departure time from his travel agent, and a 10-minute margin between arriving at the gate and being on a plane that would be hijacked and flown into the North Tower at 8:46 the morning. The aggregate of ordinary, banal decisions had produced the most significant possible outcome. A night out and a confused travel agent and a late arrival at an airport, none of which had been made with any consciousness of what they would prevent. The third season was Family Guy, at something very close to its peak creative form, despite the external pressures bearing down on it. The writing staff was still largely the original group MacFarlane had assembled. The characters were fully themselves. The stories had structure and emotional logic. The cutaways were integrated rather than dominant, used as seasoning rather than as the main course. The season contained episodes that remain landmarks of the show's run. Road to Europe sent Brian and Stewie on an adventure that demonstrated the full potential of the chemistry between those two characters. The show understood at this point that the relationship between Brian and Stewie was its most interesting ongoing dynamic, a partnership between the show's most rational adult and the show's most dangerous and unpredictable character, and it gave that partnership room to breathe. The thin white line in Brian Does Hollywood gave Brian's character a depth and specificity that the later seasons would largely abandon, exploring his self-delusion and his genuine talent in ways that balanced against each other. These episodes remembered that Brian was interesting precisely because he was wrong about himself in specific, detailed ways, not because he was simply pretentious, but because he had real gifts that he kept misapplying, real intelligence that kept being deployed in the wrong direction. That tension was the show's richest material with the character, and Season 3 knew how to use it. Mission Impossible gave Stewie some of his most perfectly calibrated scenes of the early era, including the sequence in which he conducts a negotiation with a potential future sibling within Lois's body. The comedic logic of the scene is impeccable. The premise is insane. The execution is completely serious. Stewie enters the absurd situation with the bearing of a professional negotiator and the dialogue of a parliamentary debate. The contrast between the gravity of his demeanor and the lunacy of his location is sustained with such commitment that the resulting laugh has a quality that is very difficult to manufacture artificially. It comes from genuine craft. The Parents Television Council, a media monitoring organization that had been documenting its objections to Family Guy since the earliest episodes, maintained their campaign during the third season. They included the show on their list of worst primetime programs for family viewing. They generated letters and complaints directed at Fox and at the Federal Communications Commission, objecting to specific scenes and jokes. The FCC received multiple petitions asking for the show to be blocked from broadcasting. These were formal regulatory complaints that required official responses. The show's content was generating organized opposition from groups with real institutional capacity to create regulatory pressure. Fox, caught between the commercial upside of an edgy show with a loyal following and the institutional discomfort of ongoing regulatory pressure, responded by doing what the network tended to do in moments of uncertainty. They moved the show around. They gave it difficult time slots. And eventually, facing declining ratings that their own scheduling practices had substantially manufactured, they canceled it. The cancellation after Season 3 was, from a pure creative standpoint, a genuine loss for what the show might have become if allowed to continue developing with its original team intact. The specific conditions that had produced those early seasons could not be recreated through intention alone. Chemistry in a writing room accumulates through time and collaboration and the slow development of shared understanding about what the show is and what it is trying to do. Once dispersed, it does not return simply because the people are reassembled. The show that came back in 2005 would be recognizably Family Guy. But the exact chemical formula that had produced the first 3 seasons had been changed by the 3-year gap in a way that would only become clearer with distance. Section 4, Season 4. The revival nobody expected, the changed animation, the writing room that had to start over, and the first season where something small was already wrong. When Family Guy returned from its 3-year hiatus in May of 2005, the response was everything a network executive could want from a high-profile revival. Season 4 premiered to 11.85 million viewers, a number that demonstrated the Adult Swim and DVD audience had converted into first-run viewers in substantial quantities. The show was back. Fox had placed it in a premium position on Sunday nights as the centerpiece of what the network was calling Animation Domination, a block that also included The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new Seth MacFarlane creation called American Dad, which had premiered a few months earlier in February as a special preview. MacFarlane was now one of the most prominent creative figures in network animation. He had 2 shows on Fox's most valuable animation night. He had achieved the kind of simultaneous success that the entertainment industry tends to celebrate with specific energy, the recognition that someone has not just made one thing work, but demonstrated they can make multiple things work at the same time. The business side of his career was generating momentum that would only accelerate in the years ahead. The first thing that attentive viewers noticed about Season 4 was that it looked different from what they remembered. Not dramatically different, not in a way that would provoke a general audience complaint, but different in the specific way that people who had watched the original seasons multiple times and knew the show's visual language intimately could identify almost immediately. The early seasons, particularly Seasons 2 and 3 as handled by Rough Draft Studios, had a quality that is difficult to precisely articulate but easy to recognize. The animation was loose. The characters moved with a kind of organic energy that came from artists working with slightly rougher guidelines and using that imprecision creatively. The timing of physical comedy had a slight unpredictability that felt handmade. When Peter fell down, the fall had weight and spontaneity. The outlines were sometimes slightly imprecise. These were not flaws in any strict technical sense. They were evidence of animation produced by human hands working with genuine creative energy rather than by systems optimized for precision and consistency. The Season 4 animation was cleaner. The outlines were heavier and more uniform. The character movements were more controlled and more predictable. The show looked more professional in the conventional sense, but it had lost something in the process of becoming more professional. The loose quality of the early seasons was a feature rather than a flaw, and its absence was felt in the way that the absence of imperfection is sometimes felt in art, as a flattening, a reduction in the sense that something was made by a specific person rather than by a process. Animation affects comedy in ways that are not always consciously registered by viewers, but that are physiologically real. The timing of a gag in animation is not purely a function of what is written or performed. It is also a function of how the visual information is constructed and how it moves. The way a character's face changes in response to something is part of the punchline. When the animation becomes more controlled and more predictable, the jokes that depend on timing become slightly less effective in ways that are hard to locate, but that accumulate over the course of an episode into a general impression of something slightly off. The writing had also changed, and MacFarlane was candid about why. He acknowledged in interviews that one of the most significant costs of the show's turbulent early history, the 2 cancellations and the 3-year gap, was its effect on the creative staff. When a show is canceled, writers move on. They have mortgages and careers that cannot afford to be paused indefinitely while waiting for a network to reverse a decision. The original Family Guy writing room had dispersed. Some had moved to other animated shows. Some had pursued features or live-action work. Some had started their own projects. The core of the original room was not available to simply reassemble in 2004 as if the intervening years had not happened. New writers came in. They were talented. They were familiar with the show through its DVD archive and its Adult Swim reruns. They understood what it was trying to do, but they had not been part of building it. They had not been in the room when the conventions were established. They had not been present for the thousands of small decisions that accumulate into a shared understanding of what a show is and what it is not. That specific knowledge lives in people and cannot be fully transmitted through briefings or episode guides. The cutaway gags began their expansion in Season 4. The original seasons had used cutaways with a restraint that was part of their effectiveness. A cutaway in Seasons 1 through 3 was typically brief, typically targeted, and typically placed at a moment in the scene where it could deliver maximum impact before the show returned to the main story. The joke existed in the gap between the setup and the image, and the gap was narrow by design. Narrowness gave it energy. In Season 4, the cutaways began to take longer. They started appearing more frequently. Individual gags stretched from 15 seconds to 45 seconds to sometimes over a minute. The main story began to thin. The connective tissue between cutaways became thinner. The reasons for cutaways to occur became looser. The joke was increasingly the cutaway itself rather than whatever the cutaway was saying about the scene it interrupted. Part of this shift was driven by technology. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from hiatus. The ability to clip individual segments of an episode and share them as standalone content changed the incentive structure for what kind of material was most commercially valuable. A 30-second cutaway that was completely self-contained, that required no context and no knowledge of the larger episode to be funny, could be uploaded and watched by millions of people who had never watched a full episode. Family Guy became one of the most widely circulated shows on the early internet during this period, precisely because its format produced so many self-contained clips that could be stripped from their episodes and shared as discrete entertainment objects. The format that had been a creative choice in the early seasons became a commercial strategy in the revival era, and that shift in the reason for the format had consequences for how the format was executed. Creating content for virality and creating content for storytelling are different activities, and when they compete for the same episode's runtime, one tends to win at the expense of the other. The character shifts in Season 4 were still subtle enough that casual viewers would not have identified them as problems. Peter was still mostly recognizable as the lovable fool of the early seasons, even as his behavior began drifting toward things that the original Peter would not have done. Brian's political opinions began appearing more frequently and with more emphasis, though they were still balanced by enough of his other qualities to remain in proportion. Stewie's evil genius persona was on its way out, replaced by a softer, more emotionally accessible character, though the transition was still gradual enough that his original qualities had not yet fully disappeared. Season 4 was still good television by most objective measures. It produced episodes worth watching and moments worth remembering. The talent in the room was still generating real comedy, but the foundation had shifted, and the shift would compound with every passing season into something more significant than any single season's worth of changes could represent on its own. The first crack was small. The wall still held, but something in the material had changed. Section 5, Season 5. The Emmy nomination that arrived too late, the September 11th survival story goes mainstream, Brian's first major character betrayal, and Meg starts being treated as something less than a person. Season 5 of Family Guy aired from 2006 to 2007, and it represents one of the more interesting and contradictory periods in the show's post-revival history. The show was doing two incompatible things simultaneously, producing some of its finest post-revival episodes while deepening the character changes that would eventually define its decline. Being recognized by the industry as a genuinely important piece of television, while the specific qualities that justified that recognition were beginning to erode beneath the surface. The Emmy nomination arrived in 2009, technically recognizing the show's performance in its 8th season, but the trajectory of critical appreciation that led to it was built through the post-revival period. The nomination was for Outstanding Comedy Series. It was the first time an animated television series had received that specific nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, a gap of nearly 50 years. Even The Simpsons, despite having been generally considered the gold standard of animated comedy for more than a decade, had not received that particular honor. Family Guy had. The nomination did not translate into a win. The award went to 30 Rock, which was in the early seasons of what would become a remarkable critical run. But the nomination itself was a statement. It announced that the television industry had decided to take Family Guy seriously as an artistic entity rather than simply a commercial product, that it belonged in the same conversation as the prestige live-action comedies that had defined what the medium could achieve. The story of MacFarlane's September 11th survival, which had been circulating in press coverage since shortly after the attacks, began reaching a significantly larger audience during the Season 5 promotion cycle. Profile pieces and interview features about MacFarlane during this period frequently mentioned the story, which had by then taken on the quality of an established biographical fact rather than breaking news. The combination of a hangover, an incorrect departure time from a travel agent, and a 10-minute margin between arriving at the gate and being on a plane that would be hijacked and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center had become part of the mythology of how Family Guy existed at all. The irony that a show famous for its irreverence, its willingness to joke about everything including terrible things, was created by a man who had personally survived the single most terrible event in recent American history was not lost on cultural commentators. MacFarlane navigated this irony with genuine equanimity. He did not trade on the survival story as a way of deflecting criticism or claiming special moral authority. He spoke about it as a fact, integrated it into his broader biography, and moved forward. Season 5 produced some of the most celebrated episodes in the show's post-revival period. Road to Rupert sent Brian and Stewie on a cross-country adventure that demonstrated the full potential of the chemistry between those two characters. The Road to episodes worked because they stripped away the supporting cast, the family obligations, and the town framework, and put two characters with genuinely different personalities and genuinely compatible comedic energies into situations that required them to rely on each other. The humor came from their dynamic rather than from the situations themselves, which meant it had a consistency and richness that episodic gags alone could not produce. Barely Legal was one of the finest character episodes the show had produced in its post-revival period. Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of a complicated mixture of pity, mild guilt, and the specific social paralysis that prevents people from saying what they actually think when confronted with need they do not know how to address. The episode used this premise to do something the show often struggled with, which was to take Meg's emotional life seriously while also being genuinely funny. Mila Kunis's performance was exceptional. She found the exact pitch of longing and humiliation and complicated dignity that Meg's situation required, and she played it with a commitment that the writing fully earned. Peter's Two Dads, Saving Private Brian, and Hell Comes to Quahog all demonstrated that the writing room was still capable of constructing episodes around genuine premises and following them through to satisfying places. The season was not uniformly excellent. There were episodes that showed the strain of a room producing over 20 episodes per year while maintaining a high baseline of quality. But the season had enough peaks to justify the critical attention it was receiving. What was also happening in Season 5, quieter and less visible against the backdrop of the season's genuine accomplishments, was the acceleration of Meg Griffin's transformation from a character into a function. The shift had begun in Season 4, when the jokes about Meg started moving from her being ordinary in an extraordinary family to her being specifically and actively unwanted. Season 5 pushed further. The transition was not sudden. There was no single episode that crossed a clearly defined line. It was gradual and insidious. The comments about Meg's appearance became more frequent. The family's response to her presence shifted from casual neglect to something that began to resemble genuine contempt. Peter's treatment of her acquired an edge that the early season's version of the character would not have had. The jokes about Meg being ugly and unlovable were generating laughs from the audience, and the writing room, with the unerring instinct of professional comedy writers for what produces a laugh, followed those laughs. Following the laughs is not always wrong. Comedy writers are professional entertainers, and the laugh is the primary unit of their craft. When an audience responds to something, that response is legitimate information about what is working. The problem is that following the laughs without asking what kind of laughs they are and what the show is communicating through the mechanism that produces them can lead a show somewhere it should not go. The laughs that Meg's suffering generated were real, but they were laughs that came from a place of cruelty rather than a place of recognition. The early season's version of the Meg joke was a joke about the comedy of being ordinary in an extraordinary household. That joke invited the audience to see themselves in Meg, to identify with the experience of being the least remarkable person in a room full of remarkable people. It was a joke built from sympathy. The version developing in Season 5 invited the audience to laugh at a person for existing. It was built on contempt rather than recognition, and sustaining that kind of comedy requires a commitment to dehumanization that eventually corrupts the thing it touches. The warning signs were visible in Season 5 for anyone inclined to see them. Most people were not inclined to see them, because the season was otherwise doing enough right that the one thing it was doing wrong remained in the background. But the background has a way of moving toward the foreground over time, especially when it is being actively fed. Section 6, Season 6. The WGA strike destroys the show's rhythm. Fox airs 3 episodes without permission, and the betrayal that poisoned a relationship that was already fragile. November of 2007 is the month when everything about Family Guy's relationship with Fox became permanently, visibly, irrevocably complicated. Not just strained in the way that the relationship between any creative person and any corporation that holds rights to that person's work tends to be strained. Permanently and specifically broken in a way that would take nearly 2 more decades to fully express itself. The Writers Guild of America went on strike on the 5th of November 2007. The strike was the result of contract negotiations between the Guild, representing more than 12,000 television and film writers, and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. The core issues involved compensation for digital distribution, a relatively new and rapidly expanding revenue stream that existing contracts had not adequately addressed. Writers were producing work being distributed through streaming platforms and digital download services, and generating substantial revenue for studios, but the compensation structures established when those platforms were in their infancy did not reflect how significant that revenue had become. Seth MacFarlane was a strong, consistent, and vocal supporter of the Writers Guild. Throughout his career, he understood the economic realities the strike was responding to. He believed writers should share in the commercial success of the content they created. When the strike began, he joined the picket lines and made clear in unambiguous terms that he would not complete any additional work on Family Guy until a satisfactory agreement was reached. MacFarlane's announcement meant that Family Guy entered a production hold, episodes that were already in various stages of completion, before the strike continued to exist in whatever state they had reached. But no new work would proceed. He was done until the dispute was resolved. Fox's response to this position was the thing MacFarlane subsequently described in an interview with Variety in terms that were notable for their directness. He called it a colossal act of disrespect. The precise word he used in the actual interview was more colorful than the trade publication's characterization, but the meaning was clear. Fox made the decision to air 3 episodes of Family Guy that had been completed before the strike began, broadcasting them during the strike period without obtaining MacFarlane's final creative approval. The technical position Fox occupied was defensible in a narrow legal sense. The episodes had been completed before the strike. MacFarlane's contractual obligations regarding those episodes had been substantially met before the strike began. Fox had the rights to broadcast them. Nothing in the formal contract prohibited what they were doing, but the context in which they were doing it was understood by everyone in the industry as a statement of institutional contempt. Fox was using the creative work of a man who was standing on a picket line asking for better treatment of writers, using that work to generate advertising revenue during the very period of that man's explicit refusal to work, in direct disregard of his stated position on the labor dispute that his work was financially supporting. The show was providing Fox with content and ad revenue, while its creator was standing outside asking for better pay for the people who made it. The network was using Family Guy as a mechanism to profit from the labor action that its own creator had publicly committed to supporting. MacFarlane described the episodes that aired during the strike as lacking his final creative pass. In animated television, the creator's final review of an episode before broadcast typically involves watching the completed version, identifying anything that needs adjustment, and approving the broadcast cut. The version that goes out to the audience has passed through the creator's attention and received their sign-off. The episodes Fox aired during the strike had not received that final attention. They went out as they were rather than as MacFarlane would have chosen to present them. The distinction between a finished episode and a fully approved episode might seem minor to a general audience watching on a Sunday night with no knowledge of the circumstances. The episodes played, the characters behaved as expected, the jokes landed or did not. Nothing about the viewing experience flagged anything unusual. But to MacFarlane, and to everyone in the industry who knew what had happened, the episodes represented Fox using his work against his explicitly stated professional position. The strike ended on the 12th of February 2008, after the WGA reached a new agreement with the AMPTP that included new provisions for digital residuals. MacFarlane returned to work. Family Guy resumed production. But something had been deposited in the account of the MacFarlane-Fox relationship that would not simply be withdrawn by returning to the normal professional rhythm. Season 6 was shortened by the strike's disruption. Only 12 episodes aired rather than the longer season that had been planned. The season produced Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, the ambitious 2-part episode that many fans consider among the show's finest achievements. In these episodes, Stewie finally follows through on the central promise of his early character. He kills Lois, she dies, then she comes back. Stewie takes over the world. There is a showdown. The episodes were dramatic, darkly funny, and gave the audience something they had theoretically wanted since 1999. The twist ending, revealing the entire sequence as a simulation on Stewie's computer, was both clever and deeply significant as a statement about where the character was headed. After those episodes, the world domination version of Stewie largely receded. His plots against Lois became rare. His world domination schemes faded from ongoing storylines into occasional callbacks. The simulation ending was the show's way of saying goodbye to its most original character concept, while providing enough narrative cover to avoid acknowledging directly that it was doing so. MacFarlane's subsequent public statements about Fox, which escalated steadily over the following decade before reaching the point of the 2021 Tucker Carlson tweet, can all be understood in the context of the 2007 strike as the beginning of a gradual articulation of something that had been established in that specific period. The experience of watching a network broadcast your work in deliberate disregard of your stated position on a labor dispute is not the kind of experience that a professional relationship simply absorbs and moves past. It left a mark. Section 7, Season 7. Venezuela officially bans the show. Brian Griffin becomes a political pamphlet, and the humor starts confusing volume with cleverness. Season 7 of Family Guy, airing from 2008 to 2009, documents the show's transition from a comedy that occasionally addressed political subjects to something that was beginning to use political subjects as a primary source of material in ways that changed the fundamental texture of what the show was. The Venezuela ban has become one of the more colorful footnotes in the show's history, and it illustrates something specific about what Family Guy was doing differently in its post-revival seasons. The episode 420 aired on the 19th of April 2009, one day before April 20th, the date cannabis culture had adopted as an unofficial holiday. The timing was deliberate. The content was explicit. Brian is arrested for marijuana possession. He launches a legalization campaign. He succeeds in getting the law changed. The whole town enters a prolonged state of recreational use. A musical number called A Bag of Weed was performed with genuine enthusiasm and absolutely no ambiguity about where the episode's sympathies lay. The episode was pro-legalization in a way that the early seasons had not been about virtually any political position. The early seasons had jokes with political content, but they were jokes. The political reference was the setup. The comedy was the destination. By season 7, Brian's storylines were increasingly reversing that structure. The comedy was the vehicle. The political position was the destination. The show was writing episodes in order to express positions, and the comedy was what made the expression of those positions palatable as entertainment. These are different activities, and the difference was visible in the texture of the resulting material. The Venezuelan government's Justice Minister, Tarek El Aissami, watched the episode in September of 2009, approximately 5 months after its American broadcast. In the context of the Venezuelan government's ongoing monitoring of foreign media content for material it considered harmful to public health and national values, he found what he was looking for. Venezuelan television stations were warned that continued broadcast of Family Guy would result in financial sanctions. The local station Venevisión, which had been airing the show as part of its regular American syndication programming, immediately replaced the scheduled Family Guy episode with an episode of Baywatch. The station also aired public service announcements as a form of apology to viewers for having previously broadcast content now characterized as problematic by the government. State-run television subsequently aired clips from 420 as a demonstration of American cultural propaganda, specifically showing the Bag of Weed musical number as evidence of how the United States used entertainment to promote drug use and undermine Latin American drug policy. Venezuelan Justice Minister El Aissami stated publicly that any cable stations refusing to stop airing the series would be fined, and claimed that Family Guy was an example of how the United States promoted cannabis use. The episode had become a government exhibit in a political argument that had nothing to do with anyone at Family Guy's intention when they made it. The ban generated significant press coverage, but it also highlighted something real about how the show had changed. The early Family Guy would not have produced an episode that a government could meaningfully present as advocacy for a specific policy position without substantial mischaracterization. The later Family Guy had made advocacy, dressed in the costume of comedy, a significant part of its identity. Brian Griffin's transformation during Season 7 was the most significant character development of the period, and not in any positive sense. The Brian of the original seasons had been one of the most carefully constructed characters on the show. He was intelligent, but specifically and comically so. He had actually read the books he referenced. He had actual knowledge underneath the cultural posturing. His opinions emerged from his experiences and his personality, rather than from the writer's desire to express a particular position through a convenient mouthpiece. The Brian of Season 7 and beyond had become a vehicle. He expressed positions that were clearly the show's positions, rather than positions that had emerged organically from who Brian was. His atheism, which in the early seasons had been one thread among many that made him interesting, was now sometimes the entire thread. His political liberalism, which had been a characteristic rather than a function, was now sometimes the function. The episodes that centered around Brian expressing a political or social position were not hiding the fact that they were doing what they were doing. The result was that Brian became simultaneously more prominent in the show's ideology and less interesting as a character. Characters who exist to express the writer's positions are not fully characters. They are operators. They perform a function. They do not have inner lives because inner lives would complicate the positions they need to clearly express. The process of turning Brian into the show's primary vehicle for political and social commentary required stripping away the complexity that had made him compelling in the first place. The humor of Season 7 was also becoming louder in a specific way that the early seasons had not been. The early seasons had been willing to let a joke be small, to let a specific, precisely crafted observation land quietly without announcing itself. Some of the funniest moments in Seasons 1 through 3 were almost throwaway, placed in the corner of a scene where you had to be paying attention to catch them. Those moments came from a comedy philosophy that respected the audience's intelligence and rewarded attentiveness. Season 7's humor was becoming more forceful. The jokes were bigger, more obvious, more designed to land, regardless of how carefully the audience was paying attention. The show was generating noise rather than comedy. It was establishing the principle that loud equated to funny, which is a principle that works for certain kinds of comedy, but that tends to flatten the variation and complexity that makes a show worth watching over a long period of time. The show that had once been built on the pleasure of specific, observed comedy was becoming a show that substituted extremity for specificity. Being louder is easier than being funnier. Being more extreme is easier than being more clever. And once a show discovers that it can substitute the easier thing for the harder thing and still get a reaction from the audience, the temptation to keep doing that is considerable. Section 8, Season 8. Quagmire's speech that said everything true and changed nothing. Brian gets called out, and the show demonstrates the difference between self-awareness and self-correction. Season 8 of Family Guy aired from 2009 to 2010, and within it was produced one of the most peculiar and ultimately revealing pieces of television the show ever made. Jerome is the New Black, the 7th episode of the season, contained a scene that many viewers had been waiting for since approximately Season 6, a scene in which a character said directly and comprehensively and with devastating accuracy everything that was wrong with Brian Griffin. The character who delivered this speech was Glenn Quagmire, which was itself an interesting creative choice. Quagmire had been built as one of the show's most reliable sources of a specific kind of joke. He was a cheerfully amoral womanizer whose behavior was consistently inexcusable and consistently played for laughs with no pretense of moral judgment. He was not a voice of reason. He was not a moral authority. He was the character whose function was to be exactly as bad as he was being in any given scene, and to be funny precisely because he had no interest in being anything else. Choosing Quagmire to deliver this speech was a brilliant piece of comedy construction, or a deeply revealing accident, possibly both. Because the speech that Quagmire delivered was not a joke. It was not delivered in a way that invited the audience to enjoy Quagmire's hypocrisy, or to dismiss his criticism because of the source. It was delivered as a straightforward and thorough critique of Brian that the show clearly intended the audience to receive as accurate. Quagmire told Brian he was a phony who pretended to be an intellectual while having actually accomplished nothing. He cited Brian's years of talking about his novel while never finishing it. He called out the hypocrisy of Brian's moral posturing against the backdrop of Brian's actual behavior, which consistently violated the values he claimed to hold. He noted Brian's pattern of hitting on Lois in front of Peter, his best friend, with a consistency that went beyond flirtation into something that should have destroyed the friendship years earlier. He brought up Brian's son, whom he had fathered in an earlier season and then abandoned with minimal apparent guilt. He characterized Brian's political opinions as delivered with the confidence of expertise that his actual knowledge did not support. Every specific claim in the speech was accurate. The show had depicted Brian doing every single thing that Quagmire described. This was not Quagmire exaggerating or mischaracterizing for effect. It was an honest accounting of the gap between who Brian presented himself as and who he had actually become over several seasons of increasingly poor creative decisions. The scene worked on multiple levels simultaneously. It was funny, partly because Quagmire delivering a devastating intellectual critique is inherently unexpected from a character whose primary mode of engagement with the world involves attempting to seduce women. It was cathartic for viewers who had been watching Brian's decline with increasing frustration, and it appeared to be the show's way of acknowledging that the character had drifted far from where he had started and that the writers were aware of the problem. The expectation this scene created was powerful and entirely reasonable. The show had identified the problem. It had articulated the problem with precision and authority. The natural narrative development was to do something with the identification, to use Quagmire's speech as the beginning of something rather than as a standalone piece of clever writing. The seasons that followed demonstrated that this expectation was not going to be met. Brian in the episodes after the Quagmire speech was not a Brian who was processing the criticism. He was not attempting to reconcile the gap between his self-presentation and his behavior. He was, if anything, marginally worse than he had been before the speech, as if the speech had not happened at all. The show had performed self-awareness without doing anything with the self-awareness. The Quagmire speech was a sophisticated piece of dramatic writing that was used as a pressure release valve rather than as a narrative catalyst. The writers had said what they knew needed to be said about Brian, had done so in the most effective possible way, and had then returned to operating as if the saying had discharged the obligation to do something. Brian continued to be arrogant. He continued to be hypocritical. He continued to exploit the people around him. The speech existed in the show's history. The Brian it described also continued to exist. The two things occupied the same show simultaneously without any apparent contradiction troubling anyone in the writer's room. Season 8 also produced Brian and Stewie, the episode that stands as perhaps the finest achievement of Family Guy's post-revival run, and worth examining in some detail because of what it reveals about what the show was capable of when it made the right choices. The episode is a bottle episode. Brian and Stewie get locked inside a bank vault over a weekend. They cannot leave. No other characters appear. There are no cutaway gags. There is no external plot. For approximately 22 minutes, two characters talk to each other. The conversation they have is one of the most emotionally honest pieces of writing the show produced in any season. Brian reveals that the gun he keeps in a safety deposit box in the vault is there because there are nights when he does not trust himself to live through the night without it being inaccessible. He is admitting to suicidal ideation with a quietness that hits harder than drama would. Stewie responds with a directness and depth of feeling that the original evil genius version of the character could never have accessed. He tells Brian that he matters, that if Brian were gone, the absence would be something Stewie could not carry. The episode was critically praised. It was nominated for an Emmy. It demonstrated without any ambiguity that the talent to make something genuinely great was still present in the writer's room and in the performers. The show could still do this, when it chose to. When it stripped away the machinery of cutaway gags and guest appearances and cultural references and political content and plot complications, and simply put two characters in a room and let them be honest with each other, the result was remarkable. The contrast between Brian and Stewie and the show's standard Season 8 episode is instructive precisely because the gap is so large. The show was capable of extraordinary things. It was choosing, most of the time, not to do them. The baseline had dropped while the ceiling had stayed roughly constant. What varied was not talent or resources, but the choice of how to use both. Season 8 also contained the beginnings of what would become an escalating pattern of graphic physical content. The violence in Family Guy had always been present, but it had been cartoonish, exaggerated, consequence-free in the way of classic animation. Characters got hurt in silly ways and bounced back. The humor was built on the gap between the extremity of what happened and the casualness with which it was received. In Season 8 and increasingly thereafter, the violence became more detailed and more lingering. Injuries were depicted with a specificity that went beyond slapstick into something that felt designed to produce discomfort rather than laughter. The show seemed to be discovering that graphic content generated a strong audience reaction and was mistaking the strength of that reaction for amusement. Shock and humor are related responses, but they are not the same response, and the show was beginning to confuse them. The audience recoiling from a disturbing image is not the audience laughing at a funny joke. Both produce a reaction. Only one produces comedy. Section 9, Season 9. The South Park feud that exposed everything. Conway Twitty as a metaphor for creative bankruptcy, and the season that proved the show had stopped trying. There is a specific kind of creative exhaustion that does not look like exhaustion from the outside. It does not announce itself with declining production values or with visibly diminished effort from the people making the work. It wears the costume of competence. The episodes still arrive on schedule, the animation is still professional, the cast is still performing, the cutaways still generate laughs in the room and presumably in living rooms across the country. Everything that can be measured is still being measured correctly. The ratings are still there. The renewal has arrived. The commercial machinery of the enterprise is running smoothly, which in the context of American network television means success, and success is its own justification. What exhaustion looks like under those circumstances is a show producing content that does not require it to grow. A show that has discovered the contours of its audience's expectations and is satisfying those expectations reliably without asking whether satisfying them is the most interesting or meaningful thing it could be doing. A show that has replaced the question of what to make with the answer of what has worked before, and has done so thoroughly that the replacement is invisible even to the people doing it. Season 9 of Family Guy, which aired from 2010 to 2011, did not produce the most controversial episodes in the show's history. It was not the season that generated the most public outrage or the most press coverage. It was the season in which the exhaustion became visible for the first time in the texture of the work itself, where you could look at individual creative decisions and understand them as decisions that required the least investment rather than the most. The South Park situation had been building for years before it became something that required a public response. Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park, had been critical of Family Guy's creative approach since at least the mid-2000s. Their criticism was specific and consistent. They believed that Family Guy's cutaway structure was fundamentally lazy, that the format of interrupting a story to show something unrelated and then returning to the story was a way of generating laughs without doing the work of constructing a narrative that earned those laughs. That the manatee joke, as it came to be known, was an accurate description of the show's actual process. The manatee joke was devastating in the way that effective satire is devastating, because it was specific and because its target could not deny the mechanism it described. In the South Park episode Cartoon Wars, first aired in 2006, the show depicted the writing of Family Guy as occurring through a process in which manatees in a tank selected random balls labeled with concepts, and the combination of selected balls became the joke. The manatees would choose something like Peter and Hitler and golf, and those three elements would become a cutaway gag that Family Guy would then air as if it were the product of deliberate creative thought. The critique was not that Family Guy's cutaways were all terrible. Some of them were genuinely funny, some were clever. The critique was that the process of generating them appeared to be random rather than intentional. That the cutaways did not consistently connect to anything in the main plot, did not add a layer of meaning to the story they interrupted, did not serve a purpose beyond being a separate joke that happened to occur during the episode. That they were not comedy as craft, but comedy as product, generated at volume to fill runtime and generate clips rather than constructed to mean something. McFarlane responded to this criticism publicly, and his response was interesting for what it revealed about how he understood his own show. He pushed back on the manatee characterization without fully addressing the underlying critique. He argued that Family Guy's cutaways were more carefully crafted than South Park's parody suggested, that there was genuine thought behind the placement and content of the individual gags. He was defensive in the way that creators often are when their methods are characterized reductively, even when the characterization contains significant truth. The feud between the two shows produced some of the most interesting meta-commentary in animated television during this period. South Park was not neutral ground in this argument. It had its own creative issues and its own critics who could make pointed observations about its methods. The debate between the two shows was genuinely complex. But the reason the Manatee criticism had the specific sting it did was that it described something real about Family Guy's post-revival trajectory in a way that was difficult to dismiss with a counter-argument. Watch enough Season 9 cutaways and you can identify the seams. You can see the gags that feel assembled from available parts rather than conceived as specific comedy. You can see the references to cultural figures who share no genuine connection to whatever the episode is ostensibly about, appearing because they are recognizable and therefore reaction-generating, rather than because their appearance means anything. You can see the violence escalating because escalation produces a response without requiring the additional labor of thinking about what the response means. You can see the show mistaking the audience's engagement for the audience's satisfaction. But the single most revealing creative decision of Season 9, the decision that functions almost as a self-portrait of what the show had become by this stage of its history, was the Conway Twitty gag. Conway Twitty was an American country music singer who had been popular primarily in the 1970s and 1980s. He had a distinctive appearance and a particular performance style that was earnest and committed in a way that was tonally incongruous with Family Guy's general register. He had died in 1993. He was not a figure who had any meaningful connection to Family Guy's characters, their world, or their stories. Beginning in the later seasons of Family Guy's post-revival run, the show developed a running gag in which, at various points during episodes, the show would simply cut away from whatever was happening and show an extended clip of Conway Twitty performing one of his songs. Not a parody of Conway Twitty, not a version of Conway Twitty saying something the show wanted him to say. Just Conway Twitty, performing as Conway Twitty had performed, in front of audiences who had attended Conway Twitty concerts to see Conway Twitty, doing exactly what Conway Twitty did. The gag would go on for considerable lengths of time, sometimes over a minute. The show would cut back to its own content afterward, as if nothing had happened. The first time this occurred, it was genuinely strange and therefore funny in a specific absurdist way. Absurdism depends on unexpectedness. The gag worked because it was so completely outside the established grammar of what television shows did during their runtime that the unexpectedness itself was comic. The audience was not expecting the show to simply stop and show them a country music performance. The gap between expectation and reality is large enough to generate genuine laughter. The second time it occurred, it was less unexpected and therefore somewhat less funny, but still carried the residual energy of its first appearance. By the time the gag had appeared multiple times across multiple seasons, it was no longer an absurdist joke. It was a template. It was a thing the show had learned its audience would tolerate and had decided to repeat. It had become, in the most precise possible application of the term, a bit. The Conway Twitty gag was no longer surprising. It was scheduled. This transformation from absurdist surprise to reliable bit is worth dwelling on because it reveals something fundamental about the relationship between Family Guy's comedy and the concept of artistic intention. The original cutaway structure, at its best, worked because individual cutaways were crafted to produce a specific response. Even if the response was just a laugh, the laugh was the result of a deliberate construction. Someone in the writer's room had thought of a specific juxtaposition, a specific reference, a specific escalation, and had shaped it into a gag that was designed to produce a particular effect. The Conway Twitty gag, once it became a template, was not that. It was the writer's room saying, in effect, that they had a slot in the episode and they knew that filling the slot with Conway Twitty would generate a response from the audience, and that generating the response was sufficient. The response was being generated by the pattern the audience had learned to recognize rather than by anything the episode was doing. The audience was doing the work of finding it funny because they had learned that this was the point at which they were supposed to find it funny. Season 9 also contained Brian Writes a Bestseller, which many critics and viewers identified as the episode where Brian's decline as a character reached the stage of genuine contemptibility. The premise was that Brian, perpetually struggling to produce the serious literary fiction he believes himself capable of, writes a self-help book on impulse and watches it become a massive commercial success. The episode then depicts Brian's response to this success. His response was ugly in a way the show did not appear to fully intend. He was vain, dismissive of his audience, contemptuous of the commercial success that had finally arrived for him, snobbish about the nature of the work that had achieved the success, and thoroughly unpleasant to everyone around him. None of this was presented as Brian being corrupted by success or as a commentary on the way sudden recognition can distort a person's character. It was presented as straightforward Brian behavior, consistent with who he was. The problem was that it was consistent with who he had become rather than with who he had been designed to be. The original Brian was a failing writer too. But his failures had a quality of genuine sadness and genuine self-awareness that made him sympathetic. He knew he was not producing the work he was capable of. He felt the gap between his aspiration and his output as a real wound. His pretensions were real pretensions, which is to say pretensions that concealed genuine vulnerability rather than genuine contempt. Season 9, Brian's pretensions concealed contempt. He did not love literature as something that mattered but could not always be reached. He loved his self-image as a person who loved literature, which is a very different thing and a much less interesting thing, and a thing that the comedy of the episode could not adequately redeem, because the contempt underneath it was too specific and too cold. The viewing experience of Season 9 was not uniformly bad. Episodes existed that demonstrated the show's continuing ability to produce effective comedy, to construct a gag with the kind of precision that earned the laugh rather than simply demanded it. The talent was still in the room. The craft was still there when the room chose to apply it fully. But the baseline had dropped far enough that the exceptions stood out clearly against a generally thinner surrounding body of work. When the show produced something great in Season 9, it felt like an accident, which is damning in a specific way. Greatness should feel like intention. When it feels accidental, it suggests that the show has lost track of how it achieves its best work, which means it can no longer reliably return to that work on demand. It has to hope to stumble into it rather than being able to choose it. The ratings during this period were still strong enough that Fox had no commercial reason to intervene. Family Guy was not in decline by the numbers that the network tracked and cared about. It was still one of the most watched shows in its time slot. It still generated the advertising revenue that justified its production budget. The business case for continuing to make it was unchanged. This is one of the quieter tragedies of commercial television. The way the commercial success of a declining show provides exactly the wrong signals to everyone responsible for deciding what the show should do next. The thing that is declining is the artistic ambition, the creative risk, the willingness to try something difficult and possibly fail. The thing that is being measured is ratings and revenue. The two things can diverge dramatically, and when they do, the thing being measured wins, because the thing being measured is connected to consequences, and the thing declining is connected only to the intangible quality of the experience of watching. Season 9's Conway Twitty gags were not career-ending events. They were not even particularly notable in isolation. But they were evidence of a show that had discovered it could generate a response by repeating a pattern indefinitely and had decided that generating the response was enough. That decision, applied broadly and consistently across the range of creative choices available to a writer's room, produces a show that is reliably present without being reliably alive. The show was still Family Guy. The characters were still recognizable. The voices were the same. The visual language was continuous. But something that had been at the center of it during the early seasons, something that had made it worth watching even when it was imperfect or rough or trying something that did not fully land, was no longer reliably at the center. It had moved toward the edges, appearing occasionally, carrying enough energy when it appeared to remind the audience of what the show had been and could still occasionally be. What remained at the center was production. Competent, professional, scheduled production of an entertainment product that its audience had learned to expect and would continue to watch, because familiarity is its own form of comfort and because the occasional moments of genuine quality were still spaced closely enough that you could reasonably keep watching in the hope of encountering one. This is the arc of many long-running popular cultural products, and it does not require malice or incompetence to arrive there. It requires only the normal operation of commercial incentives on creative organisms that were built for something different. The Family Guy that arrived on the scene in 1999, broke, rough, drawn in a kitchen by a sleep-deprived 24-year-old, was not a commercial product in the full sense. It was a thing someone needed to make. The Family Guy of Season 9 was a commercial product in the full sense. It was a thing that needed to be made. The distance between those two phrasings is the distance the show had traveled. and Season 9 was the season in which that distance became visible to anyone paying close enough attention. Section 10, Season 10. The episode that told the audience that Meg's suffering was necessary and the audience who accepted it. When Seahorse Seashell Party aired on October 2nd of 2011 as the second episode of Family Guy's 10th season, it generated the kind of response that arrives when a piece of entertainment crosses from something that can be enjoyed without examination into something that demands examination. The episode was the center of a crossover event involving two other Seth MacFarlane shows, American Dad and The Cleveland Show, in which a hurricane forced all of the show's characters to shelter in place. The crossover was called Night of the Hurricane. For the other two shows, the hurricane provided a backdrop for their individual premises. For Family Guy, it provided the occasion to do something the show had apparently been moving toward for multiple seasons, a moment of direct confrontation between Meg Griffin and the family that had been abusing her. The episode begins with Meg, trapped in the house with her family during the hurricane, ingesting mushrooms that Stewie has left out as part of a scheme involving Brian. What follows, as the hallucinogenic effects take hold and then lift, is the episode's central sequence. Meg, with a clarity that the show frames as the mushrooms breaking through the social conditioning that normally prevents her from saying what she thinks and feels, confronts her family. She confronts Chris about his cruelty toward her. She confronts Stewie, telling him that he is a frightening child who torments everyone around him and that the family is terrified of him without acknowledging the fear. She confronts Peter and Lois, and what she says to them is the most substantive part of the episode and the part that was most widely discussed afterward. To Lois, she says that Lois has spent years undermining Meg because Lois's own unhappiness and insecurity required someone in the house to be below her, someone she could position herself above in order to maintain the fiction of her own adequacy. She tells Lois that this pattern of behavior is abuse, that it has real consequences for Meg, and that the fact that it is habitual and dressed as casual family humor does not make it less abusive. To Peter, she is blunter. She characterizes his treatment of her as the behavior of a person who genuinely does not care whether she lives or dies, who relates to her as a minor inconvenience in his life rather than as his daughter. She identifies the gap between what a father is supposed to be and what Peter has actually been with a specificity that is among the more pointed writing the show had produced in years. The family is stunned. The episode allows the confrontation to land. The characters respond with the discomfort and recognition that the scene requires. For several minutes of runtime, the show is doing something that it had been structurally incapable of doing for several seasons, which is being honest about the dynamic it had built and honest about what that dynamic costs the person at the bottom of it. And then the episode takes its turn. The turn is this. Meg decides, after her confrontation has been received and has produced its effect, to walk back everything she said and return to her previous role. She explains her reasoning to Brian, who is the episode's other principal figure. She tells him that the family needs a scapegoat, that the dynamic requires someone to absorb the anger and dysfunction that the other members of the family cannot process on their own, that if she is not that person, the dysfunction will spread through the family and destroy it. She tells him that she has decided to continue being the family's punching bag because doing so keeps the family functional, and that keeping the family functional is worth the cost to herself. Brian listens to this, and then, in the show's most significant and most damaging choice, Brian agrees with her. He tells her that what she is doing is noble. He tells her that this kind of self-sacrifice is a mark of maturity. He validates the decision she has made to return to absorbing abuse for the sake of the people abusing her, framing it as strength rather than as tragedy. The episode ends with Meg returning to her role. The family goes on as it was. The critical response to this episode was significant and, in the context of Family Guy's history, unusually substantive. Reviewers who had been writing about the show for years came to it with questions about what it was saying and what the saying meant. The debate centered on a fundamental ambiguity in the episode's apparent intention. There were two ways to read what Seahorse Seashell Party had done. The first reading, perhaps the charitable one, was that the episode was a tragic portrait of a person so thoroughly broken by years of abuse that she had internalized the abuser's logic and was performing her own oppression as an act of apparent agency. That Meg's speech to Brian was not wisdom but rationalization, and that a sufficiently attentive viewer would recognize it as such even as the show presented it with a surface of apparent validation. The second reading was that the episode was genuinely asking its audience to accept Meg's reasoning at face value, that the show believed what Meg told Brian, that the creative team had worked themselves into a position where the logic of keeping their comedy structure intact required them to argue that the most valid outcome for a character who has been psychologically mistreated is to voluntarily continue being psychologically mistreated, and that this argument was not only acceptable but could be dressed as a kind of maturity. The problem with the first reading, the tragic interpretation, was that nothing in the subsequent seasons of the show supported it. If the episode had intended to portray Meg's decision as a tragedy or as a form of sophisticated self-delusion, the show would have needed to do something with that portrayal. It would have needed to return to Meg with awareness that her reasoning was rationalization rather than wisdom. It would have needed to treat the post Seahorse Seashell Party status quo with at least occasional acknowledgement that what Meg had chosen was not actually okay. The show did not do this. The treatment of Meg in the seasons following Seahorse Seashell Party was essentially unchanged. She continued to be the family's punching bag. The jokes about her undesirability continued. The casual cruelty of her family's treatment continued. The show had produced an episode that appeared to examine and justify its treatment of the character, and had then returned to the treatment without the examination changing anything. This suggests the second reading was closer to accurate, that the show had genuinely argued itself into believing that Meg's suffering was structural and necessary, that the writers had constructed an in-universe justification for a comedic approach that had become cruel, and that the justification had been accepted. The abuse was now rationalized. The show had looked at itself and decided it was fine. The creator of the episode, writer Wellesley Wild, gave interviews at the time in which he was thoughtful about the episode's intent and acknowledged the complexity of what it was trying to do. He expressed genuine engagement with the questions the episode raised. But thoughtfulness about what an episode is trying to do and accomplishment of what it is trying to do are separate categories. A piece of art is what it does rather than what it intends, and what Seahorse Seashell Party did was present an abused character's rationalization of her abuse as an act of noble self-sacrifice, and then return to the abuse without alteration. The episode was also notable for the quality of the Meg confrontation scenes themselves, which were among the better dramatic writing the show had produced in its post-revival era. The specific observations Meg made about her family were precise and landed with weight. Mila Kunis's performance in these scenes was excellent. The talent applied to the confrontation portion of the episode was real, which made the retreat at the end all the more deflating. What the episode ultimately revealed was the full extent to which the show had become dependent on a dynamic it could not give up. The treatment of Meg Griffin had, over the years since its origin as a relatively gentle joke about ordinariness, become central to the show's comic infrastructure. The character functioned as a reset valve, as a source of jokes that could be deployed whenever an episode needed a quick laugh without much setup. Giving her genuine agency or dignity would have required rebuilding a significant portion of the show's architecture. Seahorse Seashell Party was the show saying, as clearly as it knew how, that it was not going to do that, that the architecture would stand, that the character would remain in her function, that the justification for this was that families need scapegoats, and that choosing to be a scapegoat is a valid and even admirable form of love. The episode attracted attention not just from television critics but from mental health advocates and researchers who noted that its portrayal of the reasoning used by abuse victims to rationalize continued abuse was uncomfortably accurate. The show had, whether intentionally or not, depicted the psychological mechanism of abuse rationalization with a precision that required familiarity with how that mechanism actually operates. Whether it depicted it with the intention of critiquing it or endorsing it remained, and perhaps remains, genuinely ambiguous. What was not ambiguous was the effect. The show continued. Meg continued. The jokes continued. The episode's confrontation, which had been the most honest the show had ever been about what it was doing, produced no change in what the show was doing. The most honest moment in the show's treatment of Meg Griffin was followed by the show returning to the treatment of Meg Griffin, as if the honesty had been noted and filed under reasons why nothing needed to change. Season 10 continued after Seahorse Seashell Party with episodes that confirmed the new baseline. The political content increased, though it had not yet reached the levels of the later seasons. The violence was increasingly graphic in the ways that had been building since Season 8. The character work was thinner than it had been in the best post-revival episodes. The cutaway density remained high. But the season had said what it said in its second episode, and what it had said was that the show understood what it was doing to one of its characters and had decided that what it was doing was fine. That decision, formalized on screen with all the apparent seriousness of a character making a mature choice, was the clearest statement the show would ever make about its own values. It was not a statement that reflected well on those values, but it was honest in a way that the years of casual cruelty that had preceded it had never been, and that honesty, however uncomfortable its implications, is worth acknowledging even in retrospect. The Season 10 version of Family Guy was a show that had looked itself in the mirror and chosen what it saw. That choice would compound through the remaining seasons in ways that were predictable once you understood what had been chosen. A show that rationalizes its own worst behaviors in a primetime episode has not solved the problem of those behaviors. It has made itself responsible for them in a more fully conscious way. The seasons ahead would bear the full weight of that responsibility, and they would bear it unevenly and often in ways that served nobody well, least of all the audience that kept showing up. Section 11, Seasons 11 through 14. Brian Griffin dies on a Sunday night, the internet loses its mind, and he comes back 3 weeks later in time for Christmas. The death of Brian Griffin on the 24th of November, 2013, was, by almost any measure, the single most discussed event in Family Guy's 20-plus year history. It was discussed on social media with the volume and emotional intensity typically reserved for actual deaths of actual people. It generated news coverage in outlets that did not regularly cover animated television. It produced a Change.org petition that gathered tens of thousands of signatures within days. It prompted a wave of public grief that many observers found genuinely baffling and many others found genuinely illuminating. And then he came back 3 weeks later, on the 15th of December, 2013, in the show's Christmas episode, and the wave of public emotion was replaced by a wave of public irritation that was, in its own way, just as illuminating as the grief had been. To understand what happened and why it produced the response it did, it helps to understand what Brian Griffin had meant to the people who had been watching Family Guy since the early seasons. Brian was, from the beginning, designed as something unusual in animated television. He was the conscience of the show. He was the character whose function was to be the most adult intelligence in the room, the one who saw clearly, who was capable of genuine feeling, who could be moved by things and could articulate why he was moved. The dog conceit was brilliant and is worth appreciating separately. Making the most self-aware and emotionally intelligent character in the family a dog rather than a human was a sophisticated, creative choice. It gave the character a specific kind of freedom, the freedom to observe without fully belonging, to be both inside and outside the family simultaneously, in the way that a pet inhabits a household without being a household member in the full sense. It also allowed the show to do something with mortality that would have been tonally impossible with a human character, to acknowledge the finite nature of Brian's presence in the family, and to let that awareness of finitude add depth to the emotional content of scenes involving him. In the early seasons, Brian earned the audience's attachment. He was genuinely the best version of himself, which meant he was thoughtful and perceptive and capable of honesty in ways that the human members of the family were not. He had real relationships. His friendship with Stewie was the most consistently rich dynamic the show produced. The relationship between an adult intelligence operating in an adult context and a supernatural infant genius operating in the context of being a baby, their respective absurdities canceling each other's out in a way that produced something that felt like genuine companionship. The seasons of Brian's decline, which stretched from around season 4 through the period immediately before his death, had been painful for viewers who had watched the early seasons. They had watched the specific qualities that made Brian worth caring about erode slowly and be replaced by qualities that were progressively less admirable. The arrogance that replaced the self-awareness. The political monologues that replaced the genuine engagement. The hypocrisy that replaced the integrity. The manipulativeness that replaced the honesty. But people kept caring about Brian even as he declined, for the same reason people often keep caring about something that is disappointing them. Because they remember what it was at its best. Because the person they fell in love with is still there in some form, somewhere underneath the accumulated damage. because letting go would mean admitting that what they cared about is not coming back. Life of Brian, the sixth episode of Season 12, aired on the 24th of November 2013. The episode began as an episode about Stewie and Brian building a time machine, which was a perfectly standard Family Guy premise. The time machine was destroyed partway through the episode. In the absence of the time machine, the episode continued as a relatively normal episode. And then, near the episode's end, Brian was struck by a car. The scene was brief and brutal. A car ran Brian over in the street in front of the Griffin house. The family rushed him to a veterinarian. Brian died at the vet, surrounded by the family, with Peter and the others present, in a scene that played with the full earnestness of a dramatic death scene, rather than with the ironic distancing that Family Guy typically used when approaching emotional content. He told the family he loved them. He died. The response was immediate, enormous, and disproportionate in a way that was fascinating to observe from the outside. The social media response within hours of the episode's airing was genuinely extraordinary. Twitter and Facebook were flooded with expressions of grief that, stripped of their subject, read exactly as expressions of grief for human beings. The language was the language of loss. People described their emotional state using the vocabulary of bereavement. Some people described crying. Some described the grief as inexplicable to themselves. The Change.org petition, titled something along the lines of "A demand that Fox and Seth MacFarlane bring Brian back," gathered signatures at a rate that demonstrated the depth and breadth of the audience's emotional investment. Tens of thousands of signatures arrived within days. The story was covered in mainstream news outlets. Television critics wrote about it as a cultural event rather than simply a creative decision. From a creative standpoint, the decision to kill Brian was ambitious in a way that post-revival Family Guy rarely was. It was the kind of decision that requires genuine nerve, because it requires an acceptance that a large portion of the audience will react with hostility, and that the short-term cost of that hostility is worth paying for the long-term benefit of what the story can become in the absence of what was lost. Great dramatic storytelling kills characters when killing them is the right thing for the story. It does not protect beloved characters from narrative consequences simply because the audience loves them. The decision to replace Brian with a new character named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame, a street-smart Italian-American dog from Brooklyn, was clearly intended as a serious attempt to take the premise of Brian's absence in a specific direction. Vinny was a genuinely interesting character in his limited appearances. His dynamic with Stewie had a different texture from Brian and Stewie's relationship, rougher and more streetwise and less literary, but with its own warmth and its own comedic energy. There was a version of this creative gamble that could have worked. What killed the gamble was what came next. 3 weeks after Life of Brian, in the Christmas episode of Season 12, titled Christmas Guy, Brian returned. Stewie had stolen a time pad from a future version of himself in a different episode, and he used it to go back and push Brian out of the path of the car that had killed him. Brian was alive. Vinny was quietly written out of existence. The status quo was restored. MacFarlane gave an interview after the Resurrection episode in which he addressed the audience's response and the creative decision to bring Brian back. His framing was interesting. He said something to the effect that the experience had demonstrated that people should never take the ones they love for granted. He seemed to be presenting the entire arc, the death and the resurrection, as a single, intentional story about appreciating what you have before it is gone. The audience's response to the resurrection was not gratitude. It was anger, and the anger was more pointed and more specific than the grief had been. The grief was emotional. The anger was analytical. What the audience understood, processing the arc from death to resurrection in its full shape, was that they had been manipulated. The death had generated an emotional response that was real, a genuine expression of attachment to a character who had mattered to them. The resurrection revealed that the death had been temporary, that the attachment the show had been exploited in bad faith, that there was never going to be a version of this story where Brian stayed dead and the show genuinely explored what the family and the narrative were without him, because the show was not prepared to accept the disruption that permanent loss would have required. The audience had been asked to feel something real in response to something that was not real in any lasting sense. The death was a stunt. The grief the audience felt was genuine. The gap between the realness of the grief and the stagedness of its cause was what produced the anger. There is a term in media criticism for this kind of narrative manipulation. The term is a cheap fake-out. It is used pejoratively. It describes a narrative decision that exploits the audience's emotional investment in a character by creating the appearance of a permanent consequence while withholding the actual consequence. The audience gives their real emotion to the story. The story does not give the permanent consequence back. Seth MacFarlane, in his subsequent comments, seemed to genuinely believe he had done something meaningful with the arc. His framing of the story as a lesson about not taking loved ones for granted was earnest in tone. But earnestness about what you intended to do is not a substitute for what you actually did. What the show actually did was use a character death as a sweep stunt, generate an enormous wave of free media coverage and public emotional engagement, and then immediately reverse the premise to restore the commercial status quo. Vinny was a casualty of this restoration. He had been created specifically to be temporary, which meant Tony Sirico's genuinely charming and original work in the role was performed in service of a placeholder that was always going to be discarded. That waste is its own kind of failure, the waste of talent and energy applied to something that was never going to be allowed to matter. The seasons surrounding Brian's death, 11 through 14, were also the period in which the show's treatment of Meg reached its nadir in a different and more sustained way. The casual cruelty that had been building since the revival seasons had by this point become fully normalized in the show's internal logic. The seahorse seashell party justification was in the background, doing its work of rationalizing the status quo. Meg was mistreated in episode after episode with a consistency that had stopped requiring any setup or premise. The joke did not need context. The audience had learned to expect it and provided their own context. Mila Kunis, who had been voicing Meg since the second season, was by this period publicly discussing her frustration with the character's treatment in interviews. Her comments were measured, noting both the creative limitations of the role as it had developed and her affection for the character and the show. She was not issuing condemnations, but the fact that a principal cast member was speaking publicly about the gap between what the character could be and what the show was choosing to do with her was its own form of comment on where the show had arrived. The periods between seasons 11 and 14 also brought some genuine high points that deserve acknowledgement because declining shows are not uniformly bad, and the presence of good work makes the failures more rather than less significant. Episodes like Thanksgiving in season 10 and certain Brian and Stewie two-handers in the later seasons demonstrated that when the show focused its best writers on its best relationships and gave them room to do real work, the results were still worth the audience's time. But the proportion of those moments to the show's total output was shrinking. The average episode was thinner than it had been in the best post-revival years. The baseline quality had dropped in ways that were cumulative and visible against the show's own history. The show was not terrible. It was simply less than it had been, in ways that mattered precisely because what it had been was genuinely great. Brian's death and resurrection was the most dramatic expression of what had become the show's deepest creative problem. The show could no longer afford to let its decisions have permanent consequences. The commercial machinery had grown too large, the audience too broad, the business interests too significant for the show to accept the kind of disruption that genuine creative risk requires. The show existed now to continue existing. That purpose was not compatible with the kind of change that would have allowed it to grow. Section 12 Seasons 15 through 23 and beyond. The $200 Million Man. Tucker Carlson's tweet, the ratings collapse nobody could stop, and what it means that the show will be on television until at least 2029. In January of 2020, Seth MacFarlane signed a contract with NBC Universal valued at $200 million over 5 years. The deal covered his overall television and film output across multiple projects and properties. It was one of the largest overall deals that NBC Universal had structured for an individual creator, and it reflected both his commercial value to the studio and the extraordinary longevity of the franchise he had built from $50,000 and a kitchen table in the late 1990s. The deal also meant that Family Guy had formally become something other than what it had started as. In 1997, when MacFarlane was drawing characters in near isolation, the show was an act of individual creative necessity. In 2020, when the $200 million contract was signed, the show was an asset in a multi-year corporate arrangement with one of the largest entertainment companies in the world. Both descriptions are technically accurate. The distance between them is the distance the show had traveled over more than 2 decades, and that distance is not just chronological. A show that is an asset in a multi-year corporate arrangement has different obligations than a show that is a personal creative act. It needs to fulfill the expectations of the arrangement. It needs to remain commercially viable in ways that are compatible with the financial commitments the arrangement represents. It needs to continue existing because existing is the foundational requirement of everything else the arrangement needs it to do. The question of whether existing is the most interesting or meaningful thing the show could be doing is not really a question that the arrangement is designed to ask. The ratings during this period were telling a story that the show's continued existence made difficult to fully see. Season 4, the revival premiere in 2005, had attracted 11.85 million viewers for its debut. That number had settled into a range of 7 to 9 million through the mid-revival period. By season 13, it had declined to an average of 5.86 million viewers per episode, which was still commercially respectable for a Sunday night animated comedy. By season 20, the average viewership had fallen to 1.31 million viewers per episode, with a coveted 18 to 49 demographic rating of 0.45. By season 22, those numbers had fallen to approximately 723,000 viewers per episode and a demographic rating of 0.19. By the spring of 2026, the show was averaging somewhere around 623,000 viewers per episode, placing it firmly in the category of shows that continue to exist primarily because the business arrangements supporting them have not yet expired rather than because the audience is demanding them. To put those numbers in context, the Season 1 premiere had attracted 22 million viewers on the back of its post-Super Bowl placement. The show had lost approximately 97% of that initial audience over the course of its broadcast run. To put that another way, of every 100 people who watched the show's premiere episode, approximately 3 were still watching in 2026. The other 97 had found other places to be. These numbers were not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to the broader trajectory of broadcast television. Every major network show had experienced significant audience erosion over the same period. The fragmentation of attention across streaming platforms, social media, video games, podcasts, and 1,000 other competing entertainment options had restructured the economics and the audience sizes of broadcast television in ways that affected every show regardless of quality. Family Guy's ratings decline was part of a structural transformation, not solely a reflection of the show's specific creative trajectory, but the comparison with equivalent shows is instructive. The Simpsons, running for more than 3 decades, has also experienced significant ratings decline over its broadcast history. It does not average the viewership it commanded in its peak years. The decline is real, but The Simpsons retains a cultural authority and a level of critical and audience goodwill that Family Guy in its current incarnation does not. The difference is not simply age or longevity. The difference is what the two shows have been doing with their longevity and what that doing has communicated to the audience about whether the show still cares about being good. The Tucker Carlson situation of August 2021 was a revealing episode in the show's later history, both for what it showed about how the show was perceived and for what it suggested about where the show had arrived in the cultural landscape. Tucker Carlson, then a prominent Fox News host, tweeted what appeared to be a criticism of a Family Guy joke, describing it in terms that characterized it as propaganda or agenda-driven content. MacFarlane responded publicly with a directness that was unusual for creative figures addressing cable news personalities. The exchange generated significant media attention. It also illuminated a tension that had been present in Family Guy's relationship with its parent network and its broader cultural positioning for some time. The show had been politically outspoken for most of its post-revival run, with Brian serving as the primary vehicle for the show's explicitly liberal political content. This outspokenness had been a consistent source of tension with Fox's corporate parent, which was also home to a news division whose political orientation was roughly opposite to the positions the animated comedy was taking. The irony of this arrangement, a liberal animated comedy existing as an asset on the same corporate balance sheet as a conservative news network, was something that cultural critics had noted for years. MacFarlane had been publicly uncomfortable with this arrangement, having made statements about Fox News that were pointed and frequent. The Tucker-Carlson exchange was in some ways the sharpest public expression of attention that had been low-level and ongoing throughout the show's later seasons. The show's political content in the later seasons had intensified significantly from what it had been in the mid-revival period. Brian's political speeches, which had been occasional and fairly targeted in the earlier seasons, had become more frequent and more extended. The show appeared to have made a deliberate decision to use its platform more explicitly as a vehicle for political commentary. This decision had costs. Political comedy at its best works when the comedy and the politics are genuinely entangled, when the political observation generates the laugh rather than simply accompanying it. The Daily Show at its peak worked this way. The specific absurdities of political behavior were the material, and the comedy emerged from those absurdities being identified and presented with precision. The laughter was the result of the recognition, not a separate thing being asked for alongside the recognition. Family Guy's political content in the later seasons tended toward a different arrangement. The political position would be stated, and then a joke would be made. The two things occupied the same scene without fully integrating. The comedy and the commentary were adjacent rather than fused. This produced a viewing experience in which the political content felt didactic and the comedy felt obligatory, which is not a good outcome for either the comedy or the politics. The decision to move Family Guy from its longtime Sunday night position to Wednesday nights beginning in the 2023-24 season was significant for what it communicated about the show's place in Fox's programming. Hierarchy. Sunday nights had been the premier real estate for animated comedy on Fox for most of the show's broadcast history. Animation domination, the block that had housed Family Guy, The Simpsons, and other Fox animated properties, was one of the network's most established and valuable programming traditions. Being moved from Sunday to Wednesday nights was not a formal demotion in the language of network press releases, but it was a practical signal that the show's commercial value to the network, as measured by the ratings and advertising revenue it was generating on its most important night, had fallen below the threshold where the network could justify keeping it in prime position. The show was still being made, but it was being made in a slightly different context, one that acknowledged the realities of what the numbers were showing. The renewal announcement of April 2025 was, from one angle, a remarkable vote of confidence in a show that was performing at a small fraction of its peak viewership. Fox and the production companies behind the show committed to 4 additional seasons, running through season 27 and the 2028-29 broadcast year. In an era where shows with significantly better ratings were being canceled with minimal notice, Family Guy had secured nearly 5 more years of guaranteed production. The reasons for this renewal at those viewing numbers reveal something important about the different ways that commercial viability is calculated in contemporary television. Live viewership, the number that had collapsed from 22 million to 623,000, was no longer the only measure that mattered. DVR viewing, streaming on Hulu and other platforms, international licensing, merchandise, theme park considerations, and the value of the show's archived content in the increasingly important streaming ecosystem all contributed to calculations that made Family Guy commercially viable in ways that its live viewership alone did not suggest. The show existed as a franchise in a sense that extended well beyond the specific episodes being produced and aired. The Family Guy brand, the characters, the visual language, the decades of cultural familiarity had a commercial value that was detachable from whether the current season was good or whether anyone was watching it live on Wednesday nights. The show could have 0 live viewers and still be a valuable commercial property through its streaming presence and merchandising alone. This is the endgame of what happens to a long-running entertainment franchise that outlives the cultural moment that created it. It becomes infrastructure. It becomes a reliable commercial property that generates value through its existence and its archive, rather than through the ongoing quality of its current production. The question of whether the show should continue to exist in any artistic sense is not the question that matters to the people making the decisions that determine whether it continues to exist. MacFarlane, reflecting on the show's longevity in various interviews across its later seasons, has been genuinely interesting and genuinely candid about the gap between what the show is and what it was. He has acknowledged the things that the show lost in its long run. He has spoken about the specific qualities of the early seasons with a nostalgia that seems real rather than performed. He is a person who knows what he made and knows what it became, and who exists inside the commercial and contractual reality that shapes the relationship between those two things. He has also said things suggesting that the show, in his view, has found ways to continue being relevant and interesting even in its later seasons, which is the kind of thing a creator says about their ongoing work, and which deserves to be taken seriously as their genuine belief, even when it is also the kind of thing that the commercial context of the work makes it necessary to believe. The Meg situation continued to evolve in the later seasons in ways that were genuinely interesting, even as the core dynamic remained essentially unchanged from what it had been in the peak abuse years. The writing room had diversified significantly, bringing in writers from different backgrounds who brought different perspectives on what the show's characters could and should do. This diversification produced some genuine improvements in how Meg was occasionally written, moments in which she was allowed competence or agency or genuine emotional depth in ways that the peak abuse era writing would not have permitted. These improvements were real. They were also inconsistent, which is perhaps an honest description of the challenge of writing a character whose defining feature has been her function as a comic scapegoat. You can occasionally write against that function, and the occasional writing against it can be excellent, but the function reasserts itself because the show's basic comedy infrastructure still depends on it in ways that have not been structurally addressed. Mila Kunis continued to voice Meg through the show's later seasons with a commitment and occasional excellence that the material did not always deserve. Her occasional interviews about the character remained thoughtful and honest. She was doing real work in a role that the show's basic design philosophy had made it structurally difficult to give real work to, and the gap between her talent and the role's limitations was something she navigated with more grace than the situation required. The show's cultural footprint in its later seasons was paradoxical in a way that is specific to long-running franchises. Its current episodes were generating declining audience numbers and diminishing critical engagement. Its archive was more widely available and more widely watched than at any point in its history, thanks to streaming platforms that had made the complete run of the show accessible in ways that required no scheduling or planning. The early seasons were being discovered by viewers who had not been born when they originally aired. The show's best work was reaching its largest ever audience, simultaneously with the show's current work reaching its smallest. This paradox produces a strange kind of institutional existence. The show is simultaneously more culturally present than ever in the sense that its characters and references are known to more people than at any previous point, and less culturally vital than it was in the period when it was producing the work that earned that presence. It exists in the cultural landscape as a landmark that people reference and visit, while the building itself is in a state of gradual, managed decline. The story of Family Guy, across its 20-plus broadcast seasons, is ultimately the story of what happens when a specific and genuine creative act achieves commercial success and then must navigate the relationship between that success and the qualities that produced it. That navigation is not necessarily fatal to the creative act. Some shows manage it. Some creators find ways to sustain the qualities that made their work matter even as the commercial machinery grows larger and more demanding around the creative center. Family Guy found some of those ways, in scattered episodes and individual seasons, and the finding of them is part of the story too. The early seasons of the revival era had genuine brilliance. The Brian and Stewie episodes at their best were among the finest work in the history of animated television. The show produced comedy that earned its laughs in the most demanding sense, comedy built on specific characters with specific histories and specific relationships, comedy that required you to know who these people were in order to fully feel it. But the show also lost those ways, repeatedly and in specific identifiable moments, and the losing of them was also specific and traceable rather than mysterious. The decay was not random. It followed the logic of commercial incentives operating on a creative organism over 2 decades. Each individual step was comprehensible. Each individual decision made sense in the context that produced it. The accumulated direction of all those comprehensible decisions was a show that had traveled a very long way from a kitchen table in Connecticut. The young man who drew in that kitchen for 6 months on $50,000 and no sleep was making something because he could not make it. The institutional entity that produces Family Guy in 2026 for audiences of less than 1 million people on Wednesday nights is making something because the contracts say it should and because the franchise value makes it commercially. sensible, and because a show that has run for 27 seasons with characters known worldwide does not simply stop until the business reasons to stop it outweigh the business reasons to continue. Both of those things are Family Guy. The $50,000 pilot drawn alone at 2 in the morning and the Wednesday night episode watched by 623,000 people, while 100 times as many watched the early seasons on Hulu. The Meg confrontation scene that was honest about what the show had been doing, and the immediate retreat from that honesty. The Brian episode that could make a viewer cry, and the Brian episode that treated the crying as a promotional opportunity. The Quagmire speech that said everything true in the seasons that followed as if the saying had resolved the problem. The history of Family Guy is the history of a show that was genuinely great at the beginning, genuinely great in specific moments throughout, and genuinely diminished by the accumulated weight of 2 decades of commercial operation. It is a history worth knowing, because the patterns it traces are not unique to this show. They are the patterns of what happens to creative work inside commercial systems over time. Understanding them in this specific instance is one way of understanding something larger and more general about how the things we love in mass entertainment come to be, and then what they become, and then what that becoming costs. There is something comforting and something melancholy in the simultaneous truth that the show was once as good as it was and is now what it is. Comforting because the early seasons still exist. The pilot still exists, rough and crude and alive with the energy of someone who had no resources and no support, and drew anyway because the thing in his head needed to be outside of his head. The best episodes of the revival era still exist. Brian and Stewie in the vault still exist. The Road to episodes still exist. The things the show built at its best are permanent in the way that recorded performance is permanent, which is its own form of abundance. Melancholy, because what those early seasons represent is the product of a specific kind of creative urgency that does not survive the accumulation of success and time. That urgency is not something that can be recreated by decision. It was the product of a specific set of circumstances. A young creator with no resources and no safety net and no certainty that any of it would matter, making something as well as he possibly could because the making was what he had. The show that exists now has everything that the show that existed then had except that urgency, and the everything else turns out to be less than it might seem when the urgency is missing. But the kernel is still there, if you know where to find it. Still at the center of the early seasons, still visible in the exceptional episodes that the show continued to produce even through its decline, still present in the voice performances and in the animators' hands and in the character designs that have been with us for more than a quarter century. The family in Quahog, Rhode Island. The talking dog who wanted to be a novelist. The baby who wanted to rule the world. The ordinary girl who deserved so much better than what she got. That is the story of Family Guy, told from one angle, in one long breath, over the course of as many seasons as it has had and as many years as it has been running. The version that will always be worth knowing is still there, available on streaming and on disc, in the quality of the early seasons and the best of what came after. Find it there. That is where it keeps. And now you know the whole story. Supplemental material, additional context, and expanded coverage. Expansion Section 2. Additional. The story of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein requires a little more context to understand why it became the specific flashpoint it did. The episode was written in the second season with a premise that the writers considered sharp and genuinely funny. Peter, having made a series of financially catastrophic decisions in the way Peter consistently does, develops a belief that Jewish people are uniformly better at managing money. He subsequently wishes for a Jewish friend who can help him navigate his financial chaos, and a man named Max Weinstein obliges. The episode's joke was broadly about the absurdity of the stereotype, rather than the endorsement of it. The comedy was pointed at Peter's ignorance, rather than at Jewish people as a group. Peter was, as in most episodes, the butt of his own worldview. Fox disagreed with that reading or was not prepared to defend it to anyone who chose to disagree with it. The network's decision to keep the episode off their broadcast schedule reflected the institutional anxiety that premium advertisers bring to any content that could generate organized criticism. The calculation was not really about whether the episode was anti-Semitic. It was about whether a sufficient number of people could be persuaded to describe it as anti-Semitic, and whether that persuasion would cost the network money. The episode eventually premiered not on Fox but on Adult Swim. On the 9th of November 2003, during the period when the show was already airing in reruns on Cartoon Network's late-night block and generating the audiences that would eventually persuade Fox to revive it. The Adult Swim audience received it without the organized controversy Fox had feared. The episode was then finally aired by Fox itself on the 10th of December 2004, more than 2 years after it was produced. The delay had cost the show one of its second season episodes but had also created a minor mythology around the episode as suppressed content, which generated exactly the kind of curious engagement that the network had presumably hoped to avoid. The Carol Burnett lawsuit of March 2007 was a different kind of legal problem, though it shared the underlying structure of the When You Wish Upon a Weinstein situation in that it involved the show using something it did not own the rights to and being held accountable for it. Burnett, the legendary comedian and actress, filed suit against the show in March of 2007, citing a brief scene in which a character resembling her iconic cleaning woman character appeared in a suggestive context in an adult magazine parody. She sought $2 million in damages and alleged that the show had used her likeness and her character without permission in a context that damaged her reputation and violated her publicity rights. The suit was dismissed in May of 2007, roughly 2 months after it was filed, on First Amendment grounds. The court found that the parody and satirical use of recognizable public figures was protected speech and that the brief nature of the gag did not constitute the kind of appropriation that would support Burnett's claims. The dismissal was straightforward as a legal matter, but the suit itself was a reminder that the show's willingness to reference anything and anyone from popular culture without seeking permission was not without legal risk, and that the First Amendment protection it relied on was a defense rather than a license. Burnett, in her public statements about the suit, expressed a view that is worth noting. She did not primarily object to being parodied. She objected to the specific context in which the parody placed her character. Her argument was that there is a difference between parody as satirical commentary and parody as a way of placing someone's recognizable image in a degrading situation for shock value. That distinction maps directly onto what would become one of the central criticisms of the show's later seasons: the shift from humor that used transgression to make a point to humor that used transgression as a destination in itself. The Bourne Company lawsuit, which arrived in October of 2007, was more substantive legally than the Burnett suit and took significantly longer to resolve. The Bourne Company held the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star, the classic song from the 1940 Disney film Pinocchio. Family Guy had used a melody substantially similar to this song as the basis for I Need a Jew, the song Peter sings in When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The Bourne Company argued that this use was copyright infringement. The case went to a federal district court, where Judge Denise Cote initially found that the use could qualify as parody and therefore fair use. The Bourne Company appealed. In March of 2009, the court ruled definitively in Family Guy's favor, finding that the use of the melody in the context of a parody that commented on Peter's stereotyping was protected under fair use principles. The case was a genuine legal question about where the line between parody and infringement falls, when the parody borrows a musical structure from the original work and the resolution favored the show on substantive grounds rather than on procedural ones. What the Bourne lawsuit illustrated, and what the Carol Burnett suit reinforced, was that Family Guy's creative method of reference, parody, and allusion was not simply an aesthetic choice. It was a legal posture. The show operated in a space where the boundaries of permissible cultural borrowing were genuinely contested, and it explored those boundaries aggressively. Sometimes it won in court. Sometimes it avoided litigation through settlement or through the deterrence of the legal cost of suing a network. Sometimes it simply absorbed the cost of resolving a dispute quietly. The creative attitude of the show and its legal risk profile were not separable things. The period of the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales, which bridged the gap between the show's second cancellation and its revival, was extraordinary in ways that the entertainment industry had not previously seen. The DVD sets for the first and second seasons sold approximately 2.2 million copies, making them the best-selling television DVD releases of 2003, at a time when DVD was still the dominant home media format, and those numbers represented genuine cultural appetite rather than just casual consumer behavior. People were actively seeking the show out, purchasing it, watching it repeatedly, sharing it with other people. The Adult Swim numbers were equally remarkable. The show boosted Adult Swim's viewership in the block that carried it by 239%. For a late-night cable animation block, that is not a marginal improvement. That is a transformation. Family Guy was not fitting into a pre-existing audience. It was creating one, or more accurately, it was revealing one that had existed but had not been served by what was on television. That discovery that there was a large, passionate, underserved audience for this specific kind of animated comedy was the foundation of everything that followed. It was why Fox reversed its cancellation decision. It was why the revival attracted nearly 12 million viewers. It was why the show generated enough commercial momentum to sustain itself for another 2 decades. Understanding that the audience had to come back and find the show, had to express their attachment through consumer behavior rather than through original viewership, is important for understanding what that audience brought to the revival era. They were not passive viewers who happened to be watching. They were advocates who had campaigned for the show's return through their purchasing behavior and their ratings contributions on Adult Swim. They had skin in the game. Their attachment was active and demonstrated. When the show they had fought for began to change, their disappointment was proportionally intense. Expansion Section 3 Additional. The details of the September 11th near miss, when examined in their full specific texture, are almost novelistic in the way that the most improbable real events often are. MacFarlane had a meeting in Los Angeles. He flew from Boston. The flight was American Airlines Flight 11, departing Logan International Airport early in the morning on the 11th of September 2001. His travel agent had given him an incorrect departure time of 8:15 a.m. rather than the actual departure time of 7:45 a.m. He had also been at a party the night before and had stayed out later than was wise given the early morning flight. He arrived at the airport and was told he had missed the flight. He sat in the terminal for a while, processing the inconvenience, and then, sometime later, learned what had happened to the plane he had missed. American Airlines Flight 11 was the first aircraft used in the September 11th attacks, striking the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 inches the morning. All 92 people on board were killed. MacFarlane has spoken about the experience in interviews with a quality of equanimity that seems genuine rather than performed. He has described the survivors' response of ordinary irritation, the frustration of having missed the flight, giving way to the specific disorientation of learning that the flight's consequences were not inconvenience but death. He has not made the near miss the center of his public persona. He has integrated it into his biography as a fact about his life, rather than as an identity-defining event. The show itself handled the connection between the September 11th attacks and its own history with a mix of direct engagement and deliberate avoidance that mirrored the broader cultural uncertainty about how to incorporate the attacks into creative work. In Road to Rhode Island, which aired in the second season in 2000 before the attacks, there was a gag in which Brian and Stewie are in an airport and encounter Osama bin Laden trying to get through security. The joke was premised on bin Laden being a recognizable figure of danger, the kind of cultural reference that late 1990s American comedy made casually, before the specific attacks of 2001 gave that danger a specific and overwhelming weight. When the DVD sets for the early seasons were released after the attacks, that airport gag was removed. It was not that the joke was anti-American or that it had somehow caused harm. It was simply that the specific image of bin Laden in an airport trying to board an aircraft had acquired a context that made it impossible to watch as a light gag. Some jokes require a specific historical distance to function as jokes, and this one had lost that distance in a way that no amount of time in the immediate aftermath was going to restore. The removal was never publicized as a major decision. It was a quiet editorial choice, made in the context of producing home media releases for episodes whose original broadcast context had been dramatically altered. but it was part of the broader way that the September 11th attacks shaped the show's relationship with its own archive and with the specific kind of humor that had been available to American comedy before those attacks closed off. Certain registers of casual engagement with terrorism and with the specific figures associated with it. The third season of the show, which ran from 2001 to 2002, was produced in the shadow of those attacks and canceled during its broadcast run in 2002. The cancellation came despite the quality of the season's output. The show was producing strong episodes, the cast was performing well, the writers were finding their rhythm with the characters and the format. The cancellation was a Fox scheduling and ratings decision that had nothing to do with creative failure. The writers scattered. The cast remained attached to the show through their contractual obligations, but with no new production and no guarantee of a future, the creative community around the show dissolved in the way that professional communities do when the project that holds them together is removed. Some writers went to other animation projects, some went to live-action work, some developed their own projects. The specific combination of people and relationships that had produced the early seasons was over, and when the show came back, it would be a different combination, doing its best to reproduce the results of a chemistry that had been specific to people who were no longer together. Expansion Section 4. Additional. The animation studios that handled Family Guy across its history provide a concrete way to track one dimension of the show's evolution. Rough Draft Studios, which handled most of the animation for seasons 2 and 3, had established a visual language for the show that was energetic and slightly loose, with character expressions that read with a spontaneity that came from the studio's specific approach to the work. The studio had experience with animated comedy and understood how to use movement and timing to support comedic performance rather than just to illustrate it. The transition to a different studio for the revival era produced a cleaner and more technically consistent product that nonetheless lost something in the translation. The characters became slightly more rigid in their movement. The expressions became more predictable in the way that digital production processes tend to produce predictability. The show still looked like Family Guy, but it looked like a slightly more corporate version of itself. A version produced by systems that had been optimized for consistency rather than for the kind of organic energy that Rough Draft had brought to the earlier material. This might seem like a minor concern in the context of the show's other problems. Animation quality is not the same as writing quality, and a well-written episode can survive indifferent animation. But animation is not separate from comedy in the way that, say, the color of a chair is separate from the comfort of sitting in it. Animation is the physical medium through which the comedy operates. When the medium changes, the comedy changes with it in ways that are often felt without being consciously registered. The expansion of the writing room for the revival era brought writers who had not been present for the establishment of the show's early conventions. This is not a criticism of those writers as individuals. It is a structural observation about what happens when the people who built something are replaced by people who inherited it. The people who built it know why each element is the way it is. They can make exceptions to the established patterns because they understand what those patterns were designed to achieve and can judge when departing from them serves that purpose. The people who inherited it know what the patterns are but not always why, and so they apply them more rigidly or deviate from them without the same judgment about when deviation serves the show. The result was a writing room that was skilled at replicating the forms of what Family Guy did without always capturing the purpose behind those forms. A cutaway in the early seasons was a specific thing placed in a specific location for a specific reason. A cutaway in the revival era was increasingly a thing placed where cutaways go, without the same specificity about why this cutaway, here, now, serves this scene and this episode. This is a subtle distinction, and it has a subtle effect at the level of individual episodes. But over the course of many seasons, the accumulation of form without purpose produces a show that feels like it is going through motions it cannot fully explain. The motions are correct. The reasons for them have become unclear. Expansion, Section 5 Additional. The specific moment when the Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series was announced in 2009 was remarkable, not just for what it said about Family Guy, but for what it said about how the television industry had come to categorize animated comedy. The bias against animation in the Emmy comedy category had been long-standing and was not simply about snobbery. It was rooted in genuine uncertainty about whether the storytelling and performance challenges of animated comedy were equivalent to those of live-action comedy. The case for equivalence is strong once you think carefully about it. Voice acting is a genuine art form. The performance that Seth MacFarlane gave as Peter Griffin in the early seasons, the precise calibration of stupidity and warmth that made the character both exasperating and lovable, was not less skillful because it was captured in a recording booth rather than on a camera. The writing that produced the best early season episodes, building character dynamics over multiple seasons and using those dynamics to give individual jokes a depth that required context to fully land, was not less demanding because the medium was animation. The Flintstones comparison that naturally arose from the nomination was worth thinking about. The Flintstones had been nominated in 1,961 inches, a moment when animated primetime television was new, and the categories for what qualified as worthy of recognition had not yet calcified into their later rigidity. In the intervening 48 years, those categories had calcified significantly, and The Simpsons had spent the entire run of its first 15 years demonstrating the creative potential of animated comedy without receiving the specific Emmy recognition that the Flintstones had gotten at the beginning. The nomination for Family Guy came at a complicated moment in the show's creative history. Season 8, the season being recognized, was not the best season the show had produced. It was good television, with the bottle episode Brian and Stewie representing perhaps the finest achievement of the post-revival era. But it was also a season in which many of the problems that would define the show's later decline were already visible. The Emmy was recognizing a body of work that was declining even as it was being recognized, which produced a particular kind of irony that the show's critics could not resist noting. The question of what Mila Kunis brought to Meg Griffin is worth spending time on because it complicates the easy narrative of the character's decline. Kunis was 15 years old when she took over the role from Lacey Chabert in the second season, and the performance she delivered across the remainder of the show's run demonstrated a consistent attentiveness to the character that the writing did not always earn and sometimes actively worked against. She found a way to make Meg's specific quality of longing, the longing to be seen, to be loved, to be treated as if she mattered audible in a voice performance that the show's later seasons gave relatively little to work with. The fact that Kunis's voice work for Meg remained strong even during the periods when the character was being written most cruelly meant that the audience's response to the cruelty was more pointed than it might otherwise have been. You could hear in the performance that this was a real person in real distress, which made the fact that the show was treating that distress as a joke source more uncomfortable than it would have been if the performance had been flatter or more distanced. Expansion Section 6. Additional. The 2007 WGA strike had ramifications for animated television that were somewhat different from its effects on live-action drama and comedy. Animation production involves a longer lead time than most live-action production. Scripts are written, then storyboarded, then sent to overseas animation studios for production, then returned for editing and post-production, in a pipeline that can take a year or more from initial script to broadcast episode. This means that when production stops due to a strike, the effects are felt not immediately but over a period of months as the pipeline of already in production episodes is exhausted. The specific timing of the 2007 strike and its effect on Family Guy's Season 6 production is worth noting. The strike began in November of 2007. Episodes of Family Guy that had been completed before the strike continued to air during the strike period, which is how Fox was able to broadcast episodes without MacFarlane's final approval or participation. The dispute was not about episodes that had not yet been made. It was about episodes that had been completed under a production process from which MacFarlane was now absent, having walked out in solidarity with the writers. MacFarlane's response to Fox airing those episodes without what he characterized as his approval was reported in Variety at the time. His language was pointed. He described the decision as a serious act of disrespect toward the writers and toward himself as the show's creator and as someone who had explicitly chosen not to work during the strike. The network's position was that they had the contractual right to air completed episodes, which was technically correct. MacFarlane's position was that using his creative work as a commercial product, during a period when he was actively supporting the strike action that was challenging how creative work was compensated, was a violation of the spirit of their relationship even if it was not a violation of its letter. This distinction between the letter of a contract and the spirit of a relationship would matter more and more as the years went on. The relationship between MacFarlane and Fox, which had been productive and mutually beneficial during the show's revival period, was developing the stress fractures that would eventually become the public rupture of his 2021 comments about Tucker Carlson and the network more broadly. The 2007 strike episode was an early data point in a longer pattern of institutional friction between the show's creator and the corporate entity that held the rights to broadcast it. The 3-month hiatus that the strike imposed on the production process was also significant for what it meant to the specific creative ecosystem of the show. Television writing rooms are rhythmic organisms. They develop routines. Writers learn each other's sensibilities. Patterns of collaboration develop through repetition. The process of breaking stories, pitching jokes, arguing about characters, finding the right ending for an episode is a group activity that gets better as the group learns how to work together and worse when the group is disrupted. A 3-month stoppage is not fatal to a writing room. The writers came back, production resumed, the show continued. But the rhythm had been broken, and restoring it after a multi-month interruption is not instantaneous. There is a period of recalibration, of finding the groove again, of getting back to the specific state of collaborative fluency that produces the best work. During that period, the work is thinner. Not terrible, not unwatchable, but thinner in the specific way that work produced by people who are not quite in rhythm with each other tends to be thinner. Expansion section, 7 additional. The Venezuelan response to 420, the season 7 episode in which Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional town, was extraordinary for being one of the more extreme governmental reactions to a primetime animated comedy in American television history. Tarek El Aissami, who was serving as Venezuela's justice minister at the time, issued a formal warning to the cable stations that were airing Family Guy in Venezuela. The warning stated that stations that continued to air the show would face fines. The cable channel Venevisión reportedly replaced Family Guy in its schedule with reruns of Baywatch. The Venezuelan state television network aired clips from the episode as evidence of what it characterized as U.S. government propaganda designed to normalize drug use among young people. The underlying premise of this response is worth examining because it reveals something interesting about how Family Guy was perceived internationally that was not always visible from inside the American cultural context. From a Venezuelan government perspective that was specifically attuned to the ways American popular culture functioned as soft power, a major American network broadcast comedy advocating for drug legalization was not simply a creative expression. It was, within that framework, a deliberate communication from the American cultural establishment to global audiences. The show's popularity, the fact that it was broadcast in dozens of countries and watched by enormous international audiences, was itself part of the problem. Influential entertainment that promoted positions contrary to those the Venezuelan government was trying to maintain was a policy issue, not just an entertainment matter. This reading of Family Guy as a tool of American soft power was not unique to Venezuela. The show's willingness to engage with political topics, its specifically liberal political orientation, and its enormous global reach had made it a target for criticism from governments and cultural institutions in various countries that saw American entertainment exports as ideological products as much as commercial ones. None of this was the show's intention. The writers were not thinking about Venezuelan drug policy when they wrote the episode. But the gap between what a creative work intends and what it means in different contexts is one of the fundamental facts of mass global entertainment, and Family Guy's size meant that it could generate consequences it never anticipated in places it had never consciously addressed. Brian's evolution into a political mouthpiece during this period also had specific costs to the comedy that are worth examining carefully. The original Brian was opinionated. He had positions. He was willing to express those positions. But the way his opinions functioned in the early seasons was as character detail rather than as content delivery. His politics were part of who he was rather than what the scenes he appeared in were about. A scene with Brian in Season 2 might include a moment where his political views were visible, but the scene was about something else. By Season 7, scenes with Brian were increasingly about his political views. The views were the scene's subject matter. Other characters existed in those scenes to give Brian an audience for his positions and to provide the minimal resistance required to make the expression of those positions dramatic rather than simply declarative. The comedy in those scenes was thin because comedy about political opinions is thin when the opinions are delivered as opinions rather than as humor. Satire requires a target. A character stating their political beliefs is not satire, it is editorializing. And editorializing is not what the audience of an animated comedy is there for. The problem was self-reinforcing. The more the writers used Brian as a vehicle for political content, the more Brian became defined by that function, and the less of his other qualities remained to generate the comedy that his earlier seasons had produced. He lost the dry wit because the dry wit had existed in service of observation, and observation requires a certain detachment that advocacy cannot sustain. He lost the self-deprecation because self-deprecation requires a certain comfort with one's own limitations, and Brian's political content positioned him as the moral authority in every room he occupied, which is incompatible with the genuine self-awareness that makes self-deprecation work as comedy. He became, over the course of the seasons leading up to and including Season 7, a character who was always right. And characters who are always right are not funny, because funny requires the possibility of being wrong. Expansion, Section 8 Additional. The Emmy nomination for Brian and Stewie was recognition of something that the show's critics and fans had been saying for years, from opposite directions. The critics had been saying that Family Guy could be great when it chose to do the difficult work rather than the easy work. The fans had been saying that they wanted more of what the show had been at its best and less of what it was becoming at its worst. The Emmy nomination for a bottle episode with no cutaways, no guest stars, no pop culture references, and no physical comedy was the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, saying that they agreed with both. The episode had been a risk in a specific way that television production makes risks costly. Bottle episodes require concentrated writing. They cannot be padded with cutaways or expanded with secondary storylines. If the central relationship is not strong enough to sustain 22 minutes of honest conversation, the episode fails completely rather than partially. The writers who produced Brian and Stewie had taken the two characters that the show had been most consistent about and had asked them to be honest with each other in ways that required genuine craft to make work on screen. Brian's admission in the episode that the gun in his safety deposit box was there because he had nights when he did not trust himself landed with particular weight because it was not played for laughs. The show was capable of playing almost anything for laughs. The choice not to play this for laughs was itself a statement. It was the show saying that this character's internal life was real enough to be treated with the seriousness that real internal lives deserve. That was not a statement the show made often in its post-revival seasons. The frequency with which it chose the other path made the moments when it chose this path more significant. Stewie's response to Brian's admission, the expression of how much Brian's presence meant to him, stated with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to obscure genuine feeling behind irony, was the episode's emotional peak. The evil genius baby of Season 1 could not have said those words, not because he lacked the capacity for feeling, but because the character concept did not include that kind of vulnerable expression. The softer Stewie of the later seasons could say them, and the episode used that capacity to produce something genuinely affecting. The contrast between this episode and a typical Season 8 episode is not an argument for either approach to the exclusion of the other. A show that only did what Brian and Stewie did would be a different kind of show, perhaps more artistically ambitious but also narrower in its appeal, and less connected to the comedic energy that had made Family Guy a cultural phenomenon. The point of the contrast is not that the show should have been exclusively serious. It is that the show knew how to be extraordinary when it chose to be, and that the rarity of that choice rather than its presence was the problem. When a show demonstrates it can reach a certain level of achievement and then consistently operates well below that level, the gap is not neutral. It is a statement about what the show is willing to invest in on an ongoing basis. The Emmy nomination for Brian and Stewie was followed by seasons in which the show did not make the choices that episode had required. The ceiling was acknowledged. The average remained low. That gap between demonstrated capability and consistent output is the specific form that Family Guy's creative failure took in its post-revival seasons. Closing, like, and subscribe. And that, give or take a few decades and a couple of lawsuits, and one country music singer performing uninterrupted for 90 seconds of primetime television is the story of Family Guy? All of it. From the kitchen table in 1997 to the Wednesday night schedule in 2026, if you have made it this far, through all 12 sections, through the pilot lawsuit and the suppressed episode, and the near miss on September 11th, and the strike in the Venezuelan government, and the speech that changed nothing, and the death that lasted 3 weeks, thank you. Genuinely, that is a lot of story to sit with. If this was the kind of thing you want to find more of, subscribing is the best way to make sure you see it when it arrives. And if there is a show, a franchise, a piece of entertainment history that you think deserves the same kind of careful, long-form attention that we gave Family Guy here, leave it in the comments. We read them. We take them seriously. Every suggestion matters when you are building something that exists because people choose to spend their time with it. Take care of yourselves. Sleep well. Expansion Section 1. Additional. The question of what Jim Keeshan actually contributed to the Family Guy pilot and what that contribution was worth in terms of credit and compensation was never fully resolved in public reporting. Court filings give us the outline. Keeshan filed suit in June of 1999, approximately 5 months after the show's premiere. His company, Jim Keeshan Productions, claimed that he had provided directorial and creative contributions to the pilot that had not been acknowledged in the credits. He sought a share of the show's profits and formal recognition of his contribution. The lawsuit was settled out of court, with the settlement terms remaining confidential in the way that entertainment industry settlements typically do. MacFarlane and Fox neither admitted nor denied Keeshan's claims as part of the resolution. The settlement removed the dispute from the public record without producing a verdict that would have established, as a matter of legal fact, what Keeshan had done and what it was worth. This outcome is common in entertainment industry disputes and is genuinely unsatisfying for people who want to know what actually happened. The public record does not tell us whether Keeshan's contributions were substantial or marginal, whether the failure to credit him was an oversight or a deliberate choice, whether his claims were entirely accurate or partially exaggerated in the way that legal claims sometimes are. What we know is that there was a dispute, that it was taken seriously enough to be filed formally and pursued through the courts to the point of settlement, and that the settlement cost something that Fox and MacFarlane's respective legal teams calculated was less expensive than a trial. What the lawsuit does tell us, with complete clarity, is that the romantic narrative of the lone creator was complicated from the very beginning. MacFarlane is the person who had the vision, who developed the characters from his student films, who pitched the show to Fox, who wrote the pilot, and who has been the creative and commercial engine of the franchise for its entire run. That is all true, and none of it is seriously disputed. But even in the most individual creative acts, particularly in the technically demanding medium of animation, the pure isolation narrative is always at least partially a simplification. Other people are usually in the room, even if one person's vision is what the room is organized around. The $50,000 budget requires a specific kind of respect. To understand what MacFarlane produced for that amount, consider that even modest independent short films in the late 1990s regularly cost several times that amount. A $50,000 animation budget for a 7-minute pilot that had to demonstrate a complete creative world, introduce 6 major characters, establish a comedic register, and convince a network that the show was worth commissioning required a combination of skill, labor, resourcefulness, and the kind of creative desperation that makes people work hours they would not accept under normal circumstances. The physical process of traditional animation in the late 1990s, before digital production had fully transformed the industry, involved drawing individual frames by hand, shooting them on a camera, and editing the footage into a sequence. Even simplified animation, working from minimal character designs and economizing on the complexity of movement, required enormous amounts of labor for each minute of finished content. The 6 months MacFarlane spent on the pilot were not 6 months of occasional effort. They were 6 months of sustained work at a pace that the finished product's very existence testifies to. The Fox executives who watched the completed pilot and ordered the series were watching something that was crude, in the sense that limited resources produce crudeness, and polished in the sense that genuine talent produces a quality that resources cannot manufacture. The order was placed on the strength of the talent visible in the imperfection, which is among the more interesting acts of creative recognition in the history of animated television. Expansion Section 9 Additional. The relationship between Family Guy and South Park in the broader context of late 1990s and 2000s American animated comedy deserves some unpacking because it was not simply rivalry. It was also a genuine debate about what animated comedy was for and what made it good. Both shows had arrived at a moment when animated comedy was claiming new territory in American television. The Simpsons had demonstrated that animated comedy could be sophisticated and culturally relevant. Beavis and Butthead had demonstrated that animated comedy could be genuinely transgressive and still find an enormous audience. South Park had demonstrated that animated comedy could engage with political and social issues with a directness and a willingness to offend that live-action comedy generally could not attempt. Family Guy arrived in this context as something different from all of them. Its relationship with the cultural references it used was different from The Simpsons' more subtle allusions. Its transgression was different from South Park's in that it was not consistently in service of a specific satirical point. Its relationship with its characters was different from Beavis and Butthead's in that the characters were more fully developed people rather than pure comic constructs. The South Park critique of Family Guy, as expressed in Cartoon Wars, was partly genuine artistic disagreement and partly competitive positioning. Matt Stone and Trey Parker did not believe that the cutaway format was legitimate animation comedy writing. Their view, stated without much diplomatic softening, was that the format allowed Family Guy to generate laughs without doing the kind of craft work that they believed comedy required. A cutaway joke did not need to relate to anything in the episode. It did not need to follow from a character's specific psychology. It did not need to mean anything beyond being a standalone gag. This critique was not wrong about the later seasons of Family Guy, where the manatee description was accurate as a portrait of what the cutaway production process had become. But it was somewhat overstated as a description of the early seasons, where the best cutaways were carefully placed and served specific functions in specific scenes. The strongest early cutaways were not random. They were disproportionate, which is different. The gag was disproportionate to the setup, but the placement was intentional, and the gap between setup and gag was the comedy. McFarlane's response to Stone and Parker was defensive in tone but not entirely inaccurate in content. He argued that Family Guy's cutaways were crafted rather than randomly assembled. He pointed to specific examples of cutaways that clearly required creative thought to conceive and execute. He was correct that the manatee description was an exaggeration that did not account for the show's best work. He was perhaps less forthcoming about the extent to which the exaggeration captured the show's average work in the post-revival era. The feud generated heat because both parties were genuinely invested in what they believed animation could and should do. It was not simply two shows taking shots at each other for competitive advantage. It was a real argument about craft and about what distinguished legitimate comedy from content that merely generated laughs through low-effort means. The fact that Family Guy's subsequent seasons tended to validate the South Park critique rather than refute it is part of the reason the manatee joke has stayed in cultural circulation for the 20-plus years since it was made. Expansion Section 10 Additional. The broader context of Season 10 as a whole is worth placing Seahorse Seashell Party in. The season was notable for being the first season to air after the renewal announcement that locked the show into additional seasons, and there was a quality in the season's overall work that reflected the specific kind of creative pressure that guaranteed continuation without specific creative expectation can produce. When a show knows it will continue regardless of the quality of its current season, the incentive structure that normally pressures writers' rooms to produce strong work is altered in subtle but real ways. The survival pressure is removed. The show will air. The episodes will be made. The question becomes not whether to make something good, but what making something good actually requires, and whether the current room has the energy and the ambition to pursue it when pursuing it is no longer necessary for the show's continuation. Season 10 had moments of genuine quality. The Brian and Stewie episode had been in the previous season, but the tradition of investing in the Brian-Stewie dynamic that it represented continued to produce occasional excellent episodes. The crossover event of which Seahorse Seashell Party was a part was ambitious in its coordination across 3 different animated shows, each with their own production schedules and creative teams, an ambitious undertaking that required significant logistical effort. But the season also had the quality of a season produced by people who knew they would be back next year and the year after, which at this stage of the show's history meant a quality of doing what the show did, rather than of pushing toward what the show could do. The cutaway density remained high. The character development remained minimal between episodes. The status quo resisted change with the specific stubbornness of a show that has learned that change costs audience recognition, and that audience recognition is the show's most reliable commercial asset. The Wellesley Wild episode, for all the controversy it generated, was in this context a genuinely interesting piece of work that deserves more credit for its ambition than it usually receives. The episode tried to do something that the show's format actively resisted, which was to examine the show's own dynamics as if they were real and had real consequences. The Meg confrontation was the most honest the show had been about what it was doing in years. The retreat at the end was the show's format reasserting itself over the episode's ambition. The ambition was real even if the format won. What would have needed to be different for the episode to succeed on its own terms rather than as a case study in the limits of the show's capacity for self-examination is worth thinking about. The episode would have needed to be the beginning of something rather than a self-contained event. The confrontation would have needed to matter in subsequent episodes. Meg would have needed to change, or the show's treatment of her would have needed to change, in ways that acknowledged what had been said in that room during that hurricane. The show would have needed to be willing to accept the structural disruption that genuine change requires. The show was not able to do that. Not because the writers were not capable of imagining it, but because the commercial machinery that determined what the show was did not permit it. The character function that Meg filled was a load-bearing element of the show's comedy infrastructure, and removing a load-bearing element requires rebuilding what it was holding up. The show preferred to acknowledge the weight the element was carrying, as Seahorse Seashell Party did with genuine clarity, and then to leave the element in place. Acknowledgement as absolution. The naming of the thing as a substitute for the changing of the thing. It is a pattern visible in a lot of institutions larger than television shows. The naming of a problem is confused with the solving of it. The public acknowledgement of a failure is treated as equivalent to the change in behavior that would prevent the failure from recurring. The audience is invited to admire the honesty of the acknowledgement and to treat the admiration as a form of resolution. It is not. The acknowledgement and the change are separate acts, and only one of them actually matters. Seahorse Seashell Party was the acknowledgement. The change never came. Expansion, Section 11 Additional. The Change.org petition that appeared within days of Brian's death is worth examining as a cultural artifact separate from whatever it accomplished practically. Petitions of this kind in the social media era are frequently described dismissively as performative, as a way for people to express an emotional response without taking any action that would cost them anything. That dismissal, while understandable, misses what these petitions actually are as social phenomena. A petition calling on Fox and Seth MacFarlane to bring back a fictional talking dog was not, at its foundation, about the fictional talking dog. It was about what the fictional talking dog had represented to the people signing the petition. It was about the relationship those people had formed with a piece of entertainment over years of watching it, about the specific emotional investment they had made in a character who had felt real to them in the specific way that well-written fictional characters do feel real, about the fact that the thing they had made that emotional investment in had been removed without their consent and without any apparent consideration for what the removal would cost them. The petition was not really about Brian Griffin. It was about the audience's relationship with the show and about what the show owed that relationship. The argument embedded in the petition was that the show had earned the audience's emotional investment through years of genuine creative effort, and that the removal of a major character in a move designed primarily to generate attention constituted a betrayal of that investment. The petition was the audience saying, in the bluntest possible terms, that they were aware of the transaction and that they were refusing to accept the terms being offered. When Brian came back 3 weeks later and MacFarlane framed the resurrection as a story about not taking the ones you love for granted, he was offering a re-narration of events that the audience largely rejected. The re-narration was that the death and resurrection were a unified narrative with a lesson at its center. The audience's reading was that the death had been a commercial stunt, and that the resurrection, whatever lesson MacFarlane wanted to attach to it, was the show restoring what it had removed because the response to the removal had been commercially inconvenient. Both readings contain truth. MacFarlane may genuinely have believed in the narrative he described. The show may genuinely have intended the arc as something more than a ratings play, but intention and effect are not the same, and the effect a beloved character killed for attention and restored before the attention had fully faded was what the audience experienced. The re-narration came after the fact and required the audience to reinterpret an experience they had already processed as manipulation. Most of them declined. Tony Sirico's work as Vinny deserves a specific mention because it represents a genuine loss in the wake of Brian's resurrection. Sirico, best known for his role as Paulie Walnuts in The Sopranos, brought a specific quality to Vinny that was entirely different from what Seth MacFarlane had built into Brian. Where Brian was literary, melancholy, and quietly aspirational in a way that kept bumping against his own limitations, Vinny was direct, street-smart, warmly pragmatic, and entirely without Brian's specific brand of pretension. His relationship with Stewie was rougher and funnier in different ways. He was not trying to be Brian. He was a different dog entirely, and the different dog had a different chemistry with the family that was genuinely interesting. Sirico died in July of 2022, several years after his brief appearance as Vinny. In the context of the Brian death and resurrection arc, Vinny's existence is a footnote to a stunt. But in a different version of Family Guy's history, one in which the creative team had been willing to accept the disruption of genuine change, Vinny's introduction could have been the beginning of something rather than a placeholder waiting to be removed. Sirico's specific talent for playing a character with a specific kind of moral directness and street-level humanity was not wasted on the role. It was simply not allowed to go anywhere. The version of Family Guy that kept Vinny and explored what he brought to the family dynamics would have been a different show. Possibly a better one in specific ways, even while being a worse one in the ways that mattered most to the audience that had been with the show since the beginning. That the creative team was not willing to find out is consistent with every other major creative choice the show made after its first cancellation. When given the option between genuine change and the restoration of the familiar, the show chose the familiar. Every time. Expansion, Section, 12 Final Additional. The show's legacy, assessed from the vantage point of 2026, is genuinely complicated in a way that resists the clean narratives that entertainment journalism tends to prefer. It is not simply a tragedy of decline, though the decline is real and documented. It is not simply a triumph of longevity, though the longevity is extraordinary and commercially remarkable. It is both of those things and also something else, something that does not have a simple name. Family Guy changed what animated comedy was allowed to be on American network television. Before it arrived, the category of animated primetime comedy that was not aimed at children had a relatively small footprint and a relatively conservative definition of what it could do. The Simpsons had expanded that definition significantly. Family Guy expanded it further and in different directions, introducing a comedic register that was more chaotic, more willing to use shock as a tool, more interested in pop culture reference as a primary mode of comedy, and more explicitly constructed around moments rather than stories. The legacy of those innovations is visible in the animated landscape that exists in the show's wake. Dozens of animated comedies that came after Family Guy were built on foundations that Family Guy either helped establish or expanded beyond what had previously existed. Some of those shows are more successful artistically. Some have preserved a commitment to character-driven storytelling that Family Guy eventually abandoned, but they all exist in a space that Family Guy helped open. The early seasons remain genuinely excellent television. Not excellent in a nostalgic way, not excellent merely in the context of animation, but excellent in the way that the best comedy from any medium in any era is excellent, constructed with precision, performed with genuine skill, built on characters who feel real enough that what happens to them matters. The first 2 or 3 seasons of Family Guy belong in the same conversation with the best work that any American comedy has produced, animated or otherwise. The later seasons are what they are. The ratings tell a story. The creative decisions document themselves. The show, as it exists in 2026, is a commercial entity that continues to be made because the contracts and the business arrangements require its continued making, and it will continue to be made until those arrangements change. There is no particular shame in that. Most things that exist in the world exist for reasons more prosaic than passion. The show's continued existence ensures that it will occasionally, perhaps regularly, produce work worth watching. The talent in the room is real. The characters, however diminished, are still the characters McFarlane invented in that kitchen 28 years ago, and they still carry the residue of what they once were. What you can say for certain is that a young animator in Kent, Connecticut, decided at a very early age that he had something specific to make, and that he found a way to make it, and that what he made changed the cultural landscape in lasting ways. That is not nothing. In fact, it is quite a lot. The rest is history, which means it is complicated, and which means it is worth knowing in its full complication rather than in its simplest form, which is what we have been doing here, together, for however long this has been playing in the background of wherever you are tonight.